A lot of things happened, you know, in the year, kind of all around that event. Everybody in my life, like, they didn't believe it. Not Robert, not the Robert we know. But a lot of people didn't know me as well as they thought they did either. It wasn't something I really wanted to do, but once it was kind of agreed upon that I would do it, it just really spun out of control. Very quickly. There was no conversation about what was going to happen when we got to where we were going. Things had taken a terrible turn, and it just got worse.
Just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. I was born and raised in Salina, Kansas in August 1970. I'm the 9th of 11 children and the 6th of 6 boys. A Catholic family. My father was military, Army, so previous to my birth, my family moved around quite a lot. My father passed in August 1977, and kind of the dynamic of my family changed. Single mother, but she brought another man into the picture. Once my father passed, it really changed me. My downward spiral can be easily tracked from that day forward. For 12 years, I kind of did what I wanted, how I wanted, when I wanted. And it just evolved into criminal type behavior, minor stuff, petty theft and vandalism, and just being what, you know, in this country, what we call a kind of a miscreant or delinquent. And the drugs and alcohol came at 9. I would take alcohol to school, and while we were at recess and the other kids were playing, I would sneak off and try to drink alcohol. It's crazy, and people didn't even know. But I got away with it because I didn't look like I would do that. And they knew I was sad about my father, so they kind of left me be. My first serious brush with the law, I had some more than minor before, you know, my case now, but they were nothing serious. I stole a car. I was with a girl and we argued, and so she reported the car stolen. And I was in the wrong. She did the only thing she could do, and it cost me. And that almost put me in prison. And then I did it again a couple years later with another girl, and didn't learn my lesson the first time. And I was actually sentenced to prison in Oklahoma for that, and they gave me probation. And 3 months later, I managed to find myself in this case. My co-defendant, Steinmeier, I worked with him, and maybe we were in some way kind of kindred spirits. He was a little bit younger than me, but a lot like me, maybe more of the aggressive type. But I liked him because he was a lot like me when I was a little bit younger than him. We didn't really become close until maybe about a month before the murders happened. But in a month, we crammed a lot in. Girls and partying, drinking underage and messing with marijuana and cocaine and meth. Steinmeier, he bragged a lot, and he had talked a lot previously about robbing people and committing various crimes. I really, I talk a lot, but I wasn't really into all that. When he brought it up, I initially just kind of said no, and it was no. I mean, you can't make me do it. But as the day wore on, I bit. I said, okay. And within an hour after that, we were on our way. The planning of what was supposed to be a robbery had nothing to do with killing anybody. That never played into it initially. It just really spun out of control. We met the victims at Blanchette's Landing, and this is a word that it's kind of tough to use. It feels like predator and prey, but that is in fact what it was. We kind of stalked the victims. It was dark, and they were quite a distance away from us. But as we approached them, we could tell that it was two men, and at one point they kissed. We knew that people of a homosexual preference might be easier targets. When you're looking for somebody to rob, you certainly don't want to pick the 6'8", 300-pound bruiser. You want to pick somebody that may be an easy victim. They thought it was unusual we were out this late at night. We both looked young. My mugshot from that time will tell you I looked like I was about 12, not 19. What are you doing out so late? Well, we just came up with a quick story about we needed to get to this girl's house about 10 miles away. Will you give us a ride? Sure. And that's how we ended up in the car with them. They had been drinking. They were both quite intoxicated. We had them take us a few places, like houses we were looking for. We didn't know where we were. I knew I had a gun. At that point, an unloaded gun. I had the bullets in my pocket. We got to a point where they stopped and like, this, enough. You're having us like drive around in circles. So that's when we were gonna rob them, just when we got out of the car. There was a struggle, and while I fought with Mr. Young on the driver's side of the car, Steinmeier fought with the passenger, Mr. Parker, on the passenger side. Mr. Parker on the other side had Steinmeier down on the ground, and I pointed the gun at him and told him to get off of him, and then we all got in the car. I told him to get in the car. And that's where it went to a kidnapping. I just tell them to drive. The tension was thick. I put the bullets in the gun. We ended up on Silver's Road, and we'll just stop the car here. I just told them to stop the car. Open the door, let us out. That's what I said. And Mr. Parker let Steinmeier out, and they ended up in a confrontation immediately. And as I was getting out of the car, I ended up in a confrontation with Mr. Young. It was just nothing said, it just happened that quick. While I was struggling with Mr. Young, Mr. Parker took off running down the road. I chased him. He was maybe 50 feet ahead of me at that point. He wasn't running fast. He was running not even in a straight line. The road was uneven, and he stumbled, and as he stumbled, I fired one shot. I know now that that shot missed, but he did stumble into the ditch at that point, and I closed the distance, and as I walked up, I fired one more shot, and as I got closer, I fired one more shot. One hit above the eye and one hit below the eye. Steinmeier was still at the rear of the vehicle, and Mr. Young was at the front of the vehicle in the ditch. And he's trying to kind of scale his way out of the ditch. It was wet and muddy, and I fired one shot. And he fell backwards, and I jumped down in the ditch, and kind of at the same time I fired, and one shot hit him in the forearm. It was kind of a through and through wound, and somehow or another he turned, and I fired one more shot. That was it. The shooting happened, and it was all over within 30 seconds maybe. It was just over. And it was just silence. Steinmeier and I talked about this part, not the murders, but how we would tell the story. You say you did one, I'll say I did one. That's what partners do. He didn't want to turn himself in, and I didn't make him. But eventually, I don't know why he did. I know why I did. I was trying to get away with it. And if you turn yourself in, if you run, you look guilty. Everybody knows that, right? So we turned ourselves in, and that was the story. You say I shot one, and I'll say you shot one. And there was a homosexual advance, and that's kind of how the story went from there.
My Uncle Jerry was just a super nice guy. He would do anything for you. He never met a stranger. Everything was funny to him. He never took nothing serious. He was just out for a good time. If you wanted to do something, he was there with you. Whatever he had was yours, and he was just that type of guy. He just, anxious to help out, anxious to do anything for you. Denny and him hung out quite a bit. The only thing I really knew about Denny was that he was gay, and that a woman broke his heart, and that he wasn't ever going to be with a woman again. When we were told about Jerry, I think we were in disbelief. I mean, I don't think none of us believed it. He wasn't the type to start something or a reason for him to be killed. There was no reason to. He was 40-something years old. His knee, he couldn't walk. He had a bad heart. A 19-year-old could have knocked him down and, you know, got him off him or whatever without much effort. When Jerry died, my whole family was hurt. I think I seen my mother cry twice in my lifetime, and that was one of them. On Robert Schaefer's court dates, my mother would never go. My grandmother went and my sister went. They would come back and give us little information. I remember my sister telling me he was a young, good-looking kid until he opened his mouth. Then she said he was a cocky bastard. I'm not sure why she said that, but when he opened his mouth, she instantly hated him.
My name's Phil Greenway. I'm the Chief Trial Attorney and Assistant Prosecuting Attorney here in St. Charles County, Missouri. We'll usually get 2 or 3 murder cases a year. Not common, but it happens. And one of the duties I have is to prosecute those cases. The first impression, when Schaefer and Steinmeier turned themselves in, Schaefer gave a statement which frankly didn't quite ring true to me. It didn't seem very plausible. They claimed that they were hitchhiking, they were picked up by 2 men who they said were gay, and that the men tried to sexually assault them, and that Schaefer and Steinmeier managed to get a gun away from one of the 2 men and in self-defense shot them. The problem is, one of the victims was shot twice in the head, the other was shot once in the head. That doesn't seem like the kind of wounds that are typically inflicted by someone who's just trying to fight off an attacker. I didn't believe that initial version. But that's not unusual. When people come in to confess to the police, they usually have a version they want to sell that makes them look better than the truth would. Schaefer struck me as very manipulative. He struck me as very cruel. I also think he overestimated significantly his intellect. He's not nearly as smart as he thought he was. To him, the fact that these victims were gay, he almost viewed that as a mitigating factor, that everyone would understand why he would want to kill 2 gay men. He had some real issues with that, and I don't know why.
So when we were kids, this was a very, very quiet neighborhood. All of our friends lived on Custer, our Sheridan, Merrill. They're all American generals. So we call it the General Streets. My mother was raised in an orphanage by Catholic nuns, very strict. She didn't know how to be a mother. Even though she had all these children, she didn't know how to be a mother. We didn't get the hugs and the I love yous and the affirmations that children need. My mom and my stepdad would get into some altercation. She'd want him to leave, she'd call the police, and then didn't want him to leave. It just was always something. And that's where we grew up. There were 11 kids and 2 adults in that house, as small as it is. I don't remember a happy holiday. I don't remember just any happy times within the home. The happy times were when us kids were playing on the railroad tracks. There was a place over to the right that we built forts. And I think we all really enjoyed school because school wasn't home. He was just such a happy boy and a people person. Everybody loved him. You know, he knew everyone. We called him Nosy Rosie News Reporter because he knew the current events, everything that was going on. But yet, for some reason, he just got blamed for everything. He just couldn't do anything right. He was getting spankings all the time, or just beatings, basically. It never affected him, though. He was happy. He always had a smile on his face and rosy cheeks and was never upset or cried, even. He liked to, you know, maybe steal a thing or two, but he always got caught. So why he ever continued to do it was always baffled us. The only way that I could get away from the dysfunction was to leave. Even at 15, I struggled with doing that because I knew I was leaving 4 still there. But the only one I really worried about was Robert. I didn't come back for a long time. Robert, he had gone into the Navy for a brief period, and then after that, he didn't want to come back to Salina, so, you know, I said, well, come live with us in St. Charles. And things were going good. I mean, he babysat my son, my 2-3-year-old son. Then, you know, obviously about 6-9 months later is when that happened.
When I first met Robert, it was in 2nd grade, and Robert just blurted out, yelled out, "I'm Elvis Presley is my brother," and obviously I knew that was a lie, but yet our home lives and our energies just pulled us together. And the teacher said it was like a dark cloud of energies, and it scared the hell out of her. But nobody could break that bond since. Robert was a stunt man, a wild child. Always had to try to outdo everybody because that was his style. And the more dangerous, the better. We played around the trains when they were stopped all the time. However, Robert had to take it to another level and climb on a moving train and climb all the way up it and jump from one car to another. And here I am thinking he's gonna die. This is the last time I'm gonna see my friend. And, you know, I'm like, get down, don't do it. No, that's gonna take it too far. He stressed me the hell out, you know. As Robert and I got older, we'd drive around town with a group of friends, and we'd go through the park, and there'd be some gay people over there, and sometimes we would cozy up to them while the other ones taking all their belongings. And I don't know why we started doing that. It was maybe just the thrill of it, I guess. I'm not sure. What we didn't know is the oldest one in the group was leaving with one of the gay guys and having sex with them and then coming back. We didn't know that. I don't think that I ever thought Robert would do the crime that he did to be in jail. However, quite a few people always figured that's where he would end up. People thought it'd be stealing a car and hurting a cop or something like that. nobody ever thought it would be killing 2 gay people. That kind of violence is not in his nature. Other violence, maybe beating up a girl, his girlfriend or something, you know, okay. He's done that a few times. And Robert could get hundreds of women. He had wonderful skin complexion. He had beautiful words with the ladies. He could lay it down even in grade school. They wanted the bad boy that Robert was. And then when he slept with them, sometimes he was conflicted or confused or whatever, and that's when he would do things like maybe beating up his girlfriend or something. Tear up the girl's house or something.
I contacted Robert Schaefer when I was going through pictures and stuff of my Uncle Jerry in 2014 and kind of brought back all the stuff that happened back then. It was 24 years later. He wasn't a 19-year-old kid no more. I was interested to see what kind of person he was. And at that time, he was still claiming that David killed one of them and that he killed one and he's the one who ended up with it. And the way it made it sound was like David was more the hothead. David was more of the wound-up one than Robert was. So I just reached out to him and, you know, Robert, you spent a long time in prison. I've read up a little things and it sounds like you got the short end of the stick. And if you ever have a chance to get free, we're okay with that. I almost felt a little bit sorry for the guy. Doing something when you're 19 and being known for the worst thing you ever did in your life. That's all he's ever known for. Just want to let him know we forgive him. Robert warns me in this letter that the details of what happened on April 29th, 1990, that is quite graphic, and to prepare myself, maybe I'd like to be alone when I read it. I thought Robert was going to tell me the same thing that was written on the internet. I thought that he killed one and that David Steinmeier killed the other one. But in this letter, he takes full responsibility for everything. He told me he shot them both. He just said, hey, I did it. I can't say exactly why I did it, but I did it. There's no excuse in the world for me doing what I did. You know, he owned up to it. I did right back to Robert. I basically told him things haven't changed for us. For me and my side of the family, we forgive him. You know, I mean, whatever the parole board decides or whatever anybody decides, we're okay with. Why did I forgive Robert Schaefer? I guess the real reason, if I don't forgive somebody, how could I ever be forgiven for anything I've ever done? I mean, he's been in jail for 28 years for something he did one night that he didn't even think about. And I know my uncle would have forgiven him too. That's the way my uncle was.
I don't recall how long Schaefer held on to that first version of events, but his story started to change as the case progressed through the courts.
This morning you had a conversation with Susan McGraw. Did she advise you to not make a statement or make a statement?
She advised me not to.
Not to, okay. You still want to make a statement?
Yes, I do.
Okay, knowing...
After we had filed the charges, Schaefer wanted to talk to the police again, and he gave a different version. A version which really was not self-defense, which was essentially a confession to first-degree murder.
As we got to the stop sign in Old Town St. Peter's, Young tried to reach for the door handle. I guess he was trying to get out. This is when I knew that, you know, something more than a robbery was going to happen. I was almost sure that they were going to be shot. As a matter of fact, Steinmeier asked me if I was going to shoot him, and I told him yeah. The first shot I fired, I don't know if it hit, but the second shot I know did because I was close enough that I had blood on my right hand.
What time of the night are we talking about?
He seems almost arrogant, certainly not remorseful. You know, a lot of times these interviews are like pulling teeth. Not his. He seemed almost proud of what he'd done.
I ran from Parker back to where Young and Steinmeier were. Young was still on the ditch. As I got closer to Young, he begged for me not to shoot him, and then he said he hadn't seen my face good enough, and he wouldn't go to the police. I knew in my own mind that I was going to shoot him.
Well, why had you decided at that point to shoot him?
Well, because I'd already shot Parker, and I didn't think it would do me any good to leave Young there so he could go and tell him. I knew that he...
When I look at it, he's very matter-of-fact, doesn't seem emotionally affected by this in any way, doesn't seem to show any emotion. He's just going through and explaining how one of the men was running away and he shot him in the back.
I put 3 shells into the gun.
Schaefer decided that he wanted to obtain the death penalty. That was what he wanted to get. So he pled guilty and asked the judge to impose the death penalty, and the judge, in fact, did just that. I get the feeling that he wanted to control things. He wanted to control the way this trial proceeded, and that was a very powerful way to do it. I don't know that he really had a clearly thought out end game. I almost got the impression that Schaefer was manipulative for the sake of being manipulative, that being manipulative was an end in itself.
On that particular day.
He later claimed that the reason he targeted people he believed were gay was because they wouldn't put up as much of a fight as someone who was not gay. But I don't believe that's why he targeted them. There are 6'4" gay men who are very strong and very timid straight men. I think he targeted them out of hatred. He believed they were gay, and for him that was something that he, for whatever reason, couldn't tolerate.
Oh, I remember the day. We got a call, my wife came in the bathroom. I think I was giving my youngest daughter a bath. And she said, Robert's killed somebody. And I was like, no way. You know, I just didn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. But I almost understand it, you know, the anger. I'm not condoning what he did, and I don't agree with it, but I can definitely see it happen. If his childhood had been a little different, maybe it'd been different. Robert asked me, he says, why doesn't, you know, Mama love us? And I said, well, I don't know. Because it did seem that way, you know, because the other kids were kind of spared. They didn't ever have to suffer that, you know. We were almost like hunted. I think is a good word to use for it. You know, there were a couple times I remember waking up at night and she'd like be slapping Robert, you know, in the bed and during his sleep. I do remember my mom would, you know, call him faggot. Me too. I didn't know what a faggot was. I found out one day and it devastated me. It did. I thought, why is she calling me that? So even to this day, for me and Robert, I've talked to him, sometimes I still look in the mirror and think, do I look feminine? You know, because why would your mother call you that? I had to mess with him the same way because he looks like me. We're, you know, all American boys, I mean, right? Especially if he got molested when he was a young boy. I never had nothing happen to me. Robert did, so there could be the difference. I remember the street. This guy, you know, having the young boys in the neighborhoods come over to play the video games. We know what that means today. Having all them young boys in the neighborhood. I definitely think it affected Robert.
I would say it started 4th grade summer. 12, 13 years old, 13, so. 4th grade summer is when Robert introduced me to the child molester. This child molester ran things like he was the head honcho at a brothel for child molesters, okay? I mean, he had his own prices for each person, whatever. We were 2 kids that didn't have jobs, too young to work. We'll do about anything for money. Okay? And it was all motivated by money. And it was nice. You know, we could go to the pizza parlor and we could throw a party. We could throw a pizza party and be there all day and just have a blast. And forget about what happened to us. The money helped everything go away. It was obviously very disturbing for me when I found out the full extent of Robert's molestation. I only performed oral sex with a condom, and I let him perform oral sex on me, and that's as far as I ever let him go. For Robert, the nature of it was much more worse, much more severe, much more disturbing. We would go to, you know, certain places to do these sex acts, okay? I would have my turn, and then I would leave the van while Robert had his turn. And Robert always had $150, $200, where I would have 50 or 75, whatever. I guess I always thought Robert was better at giving oral sex for money than I did. You know, whether he did it with a condom on or not. Yeah, I guess that's all I ever thought, you know. We never talked about that aspect of the transactions. I believe it made Robert do violent, damaging things. He never put it together that him shooting those 2 guys was like getting rid of or atoning for the damage that had been done to him in his life. Whether Robert sees it or not, he had targeted these two gay guys because he'd been molested himself. That is exactly how I feel. That's exactly how a lot of people feel.
I knew that I was different, and I wasn't like some of the other boys my own age. Because it happened to me, I spent a considerable amount of my time trying to be with every girl that I could be to prove to myself or maybe others. They didn't even know that that wasn't my fault. That wasn't me. I wasn't gay. That was them. So I knew that part of it was.
It's hard listening to him talk about the abuse. He's a little disassociated, like he's talking about a story of somebody else's life. I do think that he was trying to prove to himself that he was attracted to females, not, that because that had happened, that he had maybe questioned a lot. I know that you can, joke around and call him, back then the term was faggot. That was a word that was used a lot. If you said that to him, he would get very upset.
Everybody in my life, they didn't believe it. Not Robert. Not the Robert we know, but a lot of people didn't know me as well as they thought they did either. I wasn't into anything on the side and secret. Everything I did was kind of on the surface. It was on the surface.
His masks were there wasn't one. One might come off a little bit, but there's another one underneath it. And then probably another one underneath that. He just put all these walls and masks up that I don't think anyone could have penetrated.
Did I wear a mask? Well, sure I did. I didn't really want people to know who I was. Was I the kid who had been molested? Well, I didn't display that for everybody either. Some of the way I was living makes me sound sociopathic. And I guess by definition, that's exactly the way I was living. I was doing abnormal things and then living a normal life. I never did have a resolution to the child molestation. Revenge? No, maybe just everything just came out. And the murders didn't make it any better. No, I didn't find out about any of their backgrounds till after the fact, so I didn't know. Did we think we knew? Well, sure we did, but we didn't know for sure. I had a gun. I had a loaded gun. Bad things are going to happen when you're living a criminal lifestyle and you have a loaded gun and you mean to rob somebody. It can quickly turn into a murder. And it did. And so it was impulsive that I shot. I didn't have to shoot.
Schaefer decided that he wanted to obtain the death penalty. That was what he wanted to get. So he pled guilty and asked the judge to impose a death penalty, and the judge, in fact, did just that. I get the feeling that he wanted to control things. He wanted to control the way this trial proceeded, and that was a very powerful way to do it. But I'm only speculating.
The case was just becoming frustrating beyond all imagination. I thought that if I pled guilty and asked for the death penalty, it would bring light to my case, that people would sympathize and it would cast me in a favorable light. And the old saying goes that be careful what you ask for. I asked for it and the judge gave it to me. I regret it for the impact that it had on so many people. My victim's family didn't even know that this was going to happen. They found out later that I got the death sentence. They weren't invited to the courtroom. They didn't have a chance to speak. In the United States, when you're sentenced, the victim's family has an opportunity to speak. It's called a victim impact statement. They have a chance to come up there and say whatever they so choose to you. And I wasn't prepared for that. But I also knew I was truly guilty of the murders, and I couldn't face them. And I didn't want to face them. I was ashamed of myself. And I robbed the victims, but I didn't realize that until later. If I had a chance to talk to anybody, I would probably most want to talk to him. I mean, I just didn't ruin, my victim's family's lives and my family's lives. I ruined his life.
On the night of February 17th, Sill 1974, 17-year-old Carla Walker disappeared from a Fort Worth parking lot, and for nearly half a century, the question of who took her seemed destined to remain unanswered. She had gone out that evening with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, after attending a Valentine's Day dance. It should have been an ordinary teenage night in Texas. Instead, it became the beginning of one of the region's most haunting cold cases. The scene was a bowling alley parking lot in Fort Worth, a place where cars came and went, where teenagers gathered, where nothing about the darkness suggested that a crime of extraordinary brutality was about to unfold. Carla and Rodney were inside their vehicle when the attack came suddenly. According to the later court record, a man yanked open the car door, dragged Carla out, and struck Rodney with a pistol. In seconds, the parking lot became a crime scene. Rodney was left behind. Carla was taken, and the person responsible vanished into the night. What happened next would haunt her family and investigators for decades. Carla's body was discovered 3 days later in a culvert. The autopsy determined that she had been strangled and that she had likely been sexually assaulted. The discovery transformed the investigation from a desperate search for a missing teenager into a homicide investigation involving a young woman whose life had been violently taken before she had the chance to grow older, build a career, raise a family, or simply experience the ordinary future that had been waiting for her. Detectives immediately began searching for answers. Leads came in. Names surfaced. Possibilities multiplied. Investigators worked through hundreds of leads, trying to reconstruct those final hours and identify the person who had entered Carla's life for a few terrifying moments before disappearing. One piece of evidence immediately attracted attention: a magazine from a Ruger pistol recovered from the bowling alley parking lot. Investigators identified several people in the Fort Worth area who owned that type of firearm. Among those individuals was a man named Glenn Samuel McCurry. At the time, however, investigators did not have the forensic technology that would eventually change the entire case. McCurley was interviewed during the original investigation. He told detectives that his pistol had been stolen before Carla's murder. He was given a polygraph examination and was released. The investigation continued, but the evidence available at the time did not produce an arrest. The years began to pass, then decades. The case became cold. A cold case is a phrase that can sound almost clinical, but behind those words are people who never stopped waiting. Carla's family had to continue living with a question that had no answer. Who had taken her? Who had killed her? And why had that person been able to disappear so completely? Fort Worth changed around the investigation. Technology changed. Police officers retired. New detectives entered the department who had not even been alive when Carla was murdered. Yet the evidence remained. Somewhere inside the old case file were photographs, reports, physical evidence, and biological material collected when forensic science was operating in a completely different era. The case had not been solved, but neither had it been erased. For years, investigators had pushed the limits of the technology available to them. DNA testing eventually became an important part of criminal investigations, but the biological material connected to Carla's case presented a difficult challenge. The evidence was more than 4 decades old. Scientists had to determine whether modern techniques could recover enough genetic information to create a usable profile. That question would eventually become the turning point. In 2019, investigators reopened the case and began systematically reviewing the original file and the people who had appeared in the investigation decades earlier. Detectives Leah Wagner and Jay Bennett were among those working the reopened investigation. The old suspect list was examined again. Names that had once been dismissed were reconsidered. Evidence was sent for advanced DNA testing. What investigators needed was not another rumor, another anonymous tip, or another theory. They needed science. They needed the old evidence to speak. At a forensic laboratory, genetic material recovered from Carla's clothing was subjected to modern analysis. The results were extraordinary. Scientists were able to develop a single-source DNA profile belonging to an unknown male from genetic material recovered from Carla's bra. Suddenly, an investigation that had been frozen for decades possessed something it had never had before: a detailed genetic profile from the unknown man connected to the crime. The next step was critical. Investigators submitted the profile to CODIS, the National Law Enforcement DNA database. They waited for the result. Nothing. No match. The unknown man remained unknown. For a moment, the breakthrough seemed to produce another dead end. But investigators had a new option that had not existed in 1974. Instead of searching only for the offender himself, they could look for biological relatives. The DNA was entered into a genealogical database, and investigators began following genetic connections. The search narrowed. The names became fewer. The family relationships began forming a path. That path eventually pointed investigators toward the McCurley family, including Glenn McCurley and his two brothers. The man who had been interviewed in connection with the case in 1974 had suddenly returned to the center of the investigation almost half a century later. But investigators still needed direct confirmation. A genealogical connection could provide a lead, but it was not enough by itself. Detectives needed DNA directly associated with McCurley. They obtained discarded material from outside his residence and sent it for forensic comparison. The result was devastatingly clear. The DNA recovered from the discarded material matched the male DNA profile developed from Carla's clothing. A piece of evidence collected in the 1970s had finally connected to a living man nearly 50 years later. The case that had resisted generations of investigators was suddenly moving at extraordinary speed. On September 21st, SIL 2020, Glenn Samuel McCurley was arrested and charged with capital murder. He was 77 years old. Carla Walker had been 17 when she was killed. 46 years had passed between the crime and the arrest. The numbers alone were difficult to comprehend. 46 years of unanswered questions. 46 years of an investigation that refused to disappear. 46 years between the moment Carla was taken from that parking lot and the moment investigators finally placed handcuffs on the man whose DNA connected him to the evidence. For Carla's family, the arrest was not simply a headline. It was the return of a name they had spent decades waiting to hear. For the detectives, it was proof that the old case file had never truly been dead. And for the wider world, it was another extraordinary demonstration of what modern forensic science could do with evidence collected long before today's technology existed. But even after the arrest, the story was far from finished. The prosecution still had to prove its case. McCurley would have the opportunity to challenge the evidence. Investigators would have to explain how the DNA connection had been established and how a man questioned in 1974 had eventually become the central figure in the investigation. The case had survived nearly half a century of silence, but now it was entering the courtroom. And somewhere behind the legal documents, the forensic reports, and the headlines was the same young woman at the center of it all. Carla Walker, 17 years old, taken from a parking lot on a February night in 1974, remembered by a family that refused to let her become just another forgotten name in an old police file. The decades had changed almost everything around her, but they had not erased her story. They had only delayed the moment when the evidence would finally reveal who had been responsible. The first hours after Carla Walker disappeared were filled with uncertainty, but by the time investigators found her body 3 days later, the uncertainty had become something far darker. The 17-year-old Fort Worth teenager was no longer missing. She had been murdered. The search for a living girl had become an investigation into a homicide, and every detail from the night of February 17th, Sill, 1974, suddenly carried a different meaning. Investigators had to reconstruct a sequence of events from fragments, beginning with the parking lot where Carla had last been seen alive. She and Rodney McCoy had been together that evening after attending a Valentine's Day dance. They went to a bowling alley in Fort Worth. Inside the vehicle, they were suddenly confronted by an armed man. The attacker pulled Carla from the car and struck Rodney with a pistol. Then he took Carla away. Rodney survived the attack, but Carla vanished. The scene contained one of the earliest pieces of physical evidence that would eventually become crucial: a magazine from a Ruger pistol. Investigators followed that lead. People who owned or possessed similar firearms were identified and questioned. Among them was Glenn Samuel McCurry. At that stage, there was no DNA technology capable of answering the question that would eventually dominate the case. Detectives had to rely on interviews, physical descriptions, weapon information, witness accounts, and whatever forensic evidence could be analyzed using the tools available in 1974. McCurley told investigators that his Ruger pistol had been stolen before the crime. He was questioned and took a polygraph examination. He was not arrested. The investigation continued in other directions, but the case never disappeared completely. The murder of a 17-year-old girl in a community where people knew her created an enduring demand for answers. Detectives followed leads. Investigators considered suspects. Information was gathered and compared, yet no prosecution emerged. There was no definitive forensic link capable of identifying the killer. There was no modern DNA database waiting to produce a match. There was no genetic genealogy capable of reaching through a family tree and pointing investigators toward a distant relative. There was only the evidence they had and the limits of the science available to interpret it. Then the calendar began moving forward. 1 year became 5, 5 became 10, 10 became 20. The world around the case changed while Carla remained 17 forever. The original investigators grew older. Some retired. New officers joined the department. The technology used to investigate crime underwent enormous changes. DNA profiling moved from an emerging scientific technique into one of the most important tools in modern criminal investigations. But the Carla Walker case remained unsolved. Eventually, the investigation became what law enforcement calls a cold case. The phrase can make a case sound dormant, almost forgotten, but Carla's family never had the luxury of forgetting. There was no final explanation for what happened to her. There was no person held accountable. There was only a collection of memories and a file containing evidence from a night that had become distant in time but never distant emotionally. Then, decades after the murder, forensic science created a new possibility. Investigators began revisiting old cases with biological evidence that had previously been impossible to analyze in the same way. The principle was straightforward but revolutionary. Evidence collected decades ago did not necessarily become useless merely because technology had changed. Sometimes the evidence simply had to wait for science to catch up. Carla's case contained biological material recovered during the original investigation. The material was examined using modern forensic techniques, and investigators were eventually able to develop a male DNA profile from genetic material recovered from Carla's bra. That profile represented a dramatic change in the investigation. For nearly half a century, investigators had been trying to identify a person through conventional investigative methods. Now they possessed something far more precise: a genetic signature associated with the unknown male connected to the evidence. The first obvious destination was CODIS, the National Law Enforcement DNA Database. Investigators submitted the profile, hoping the system would identify a known offender whose DNA had already been collected. But the database produced no match. The result could have been devastating. After decades of waiting, investigators finally had a DNA profile, yet there was no name attached to it. The unknown man remained unknown. But the absence of a CODIS match did not mean the investigation had reached another dead end. It meant investigators had to change the question. Instead of asking, "Where is this exact DNA profile already stored?" they could ask, "Who is biologically related to the person who left this DNA?" That question opened a completely different investigative path. Genetic genealogy had become an emerging tool in cold case investigations, using genetic relationships to construct family connections that could eventually narrow an unknown person's identity. The technique required patience and careful analysis. Investigators could not simply type a DNA profile into a computer and receive the killer's name. They had to examine genetic relationships, identify family branches, research genealogical records, and determine which individuals could realistically fit the known facts of the case. In Carla's investigation, that work eventually led detectives toward the McCurley family. Suddenly, a name from the original investigation was back in focus. Glenn Samuel McCurley had been questioned in 1974. His name had appeared because of the Ruger pistol connection. Decades earlier, investigators had not possessed the technology necessary to establish whether he was biologically connected to the evidence recovered from Carla. Now they had a new reason to examine him. The investigation had come full circle, but investigators did not simply accept the genealogical connection as proof. They needed direct forensic confirmation. A suspect's family history could generate a lead, but a criminal prosecution required stronger evidence. Detectives obtained discarded material associated with McCurley and sent it for DNA analysis. The comparison produced the result investigators had been searching for. The DNA from the discarded material matched the male DNA profile recovered from Carla's clothing. After decades of uncertainty, the biological evidence had produced a direct connection. The significance of that result was enormous. The man who had once been interviewed during the original investigation was now linked through modern DNA technology to biological evidence from the crime scene. The investigation that had started in 1974 had suddenly accelerated. Detectives had not discovered a new witness who happened to remember an old detail. They had not uncovered a confession hidden inside an old box. They had found something more powerful, a scientific connection between evidence preserved from the original crime and a living suspect. The case moved toward prosecution. McCurley was arrested on September 21st, SIL 2020, and charged with capital murder. He was 77 years old. Nearly half a century had passed since Carla had been taken from that Fort Worth parking lot. For the detectives who worked the reopened case, the arrest represented the culmination of an investigation that had crossed generations. For the Walker family, however, the arrest carried a much heavier meaning. A name had finally been attached to the crime. The person accused of killing Carla was no longer an unknown figure who could exist anywhere. He had been identified, located, arrested, and placed inside the criminal justice system. Yet the DNA breakthrough also created a painful realization. Modern science had solved a mystery that traditional investigation had been unable to resolve for decades. The evidence had been there. The biological material had survived. The answer had been hidden inside it, waiting for technology capable of extracting its meaning. And as the investigation moved forward, the story of Carla Walker became a powerful example of how a cold case can remain alive beneath the surface, waiting for one new piece of science to change everything. The murder had begun with a violent encounter in a bowling alley parking lot in 1974. It had passed through years of frustration, unanswered questions, and investigative uncertainty. It had survived the retirement of detectives and the disappearance of memory. And now, almost half a century later, it had reached the courtroom with a piece of evidence that could speak more clearly than any witness ever could. The DNA had finally given investigators something they had never possessed before, a direct biological connection. But the arrest was only the beginning of the final chapter. The evidence would have to withstand legal scrutiny. Prosecutors would have to present the history of the investigation. The defense would have its own arguments, and Carla's family would have to face the man whose identity had remained hidden for most of their lives. After 46 years, the question was no longer simply whether Carla Walker's killer could be found. He had been found. The question now was whether the justice system could finally transform that scientific discovery into accountability. Part 3. Moves into the reopened investigation, the forensic breakthrough, and the increasingly narrow path leading investigators back to Glenn McCurley, using documented facts rather than invented scenes or dialogue. For nearly half a century, the name Glenn Samuel McCurley existed on the edge of the Carla Walker investigation without becoming the answer. In 1974, he had been one of the people questioned because investigators knew he owned a Ruger pistol, the type of weapon associated with the abduction. He had provided an explanation. He had taken a polygraph examination. The investigation moved on. Decades later, that same name would return with an entirely different significance. But before investigators could reach that point, they had to reopen a case that had been dormant for years and ask an uncomfortable question. What had the original investigation missed, and what could modern science reveal that investigators in 1974 had been unable to see? In 2019, Fort Worth Police Department detectives Leah Wagner and Jay Bennett reopened the investigation. They were not starting from nothing. They had the original case file, historical reports, physical evidence, and biological material that had survived since Carla's murder. But they were working in a completely different forensic area. DNA science had advanced dramatically. Laboratories could analyze biological material that previous generations of investigators could not use in the same way. Genetic genealogy had also become a new investigative tool, allowing detectives to search beyond conventional criminal databases when an unknown DNA profile did not produce a direct match. The first major breakthrough came when forensic testing produced a male DNA profile from biological material associated with Carla's clothing. The significance was enormous. For decades, investigators had possessed evidence but lacked the technology necessary to convert that evidence into an identifying profile. Now there was a genetic signature, but a profile without a name was still a mystery. Investigators submitted the DNA to CODIS, the National Law Enforcement DNA database, looking for a direct match. There was none. The result could have stopped the investigation. Instead, it forced detectives to take another route. They turned to genetic genealogy. The concept was revolutionary but increasingly familiar in cold case investigations. Rather than searching only for the exact person whose DNA had been recovered, investigators could search for genetic relatives. Distant biological connections could reveal family branches, and those branches could be researched through genealogical records. A genetic profile might not immediately say, "This is the killer." It could instead say, "This person belongs to this family." From there, investigators could begin narrowing the possibilities. In Carla's case, that process eventually pointed toward the McCurley family. The name that had appeared in the original 1974 investigation was suddenly relevant again. Glenn McCurley was no longer simply a man who had once been questioned because of a firearm. He was now a potential genetic match connected to biological evidence from the crime. But investigators understood that genealogy alone could not establish guilt. They needed direct confirmation. The forensic trail had to move from a family tree to an individual. Detectives began working toward obtaining a DNA sample that could be compared directly with the unknown male profile. In July 2020, investigators collected discarded material from outside McCurley's home. The sample was sent for analysis. On September 4th, the DNA from that discarded material was reported to match the DNA profile developed from evidence recovered from Carla's clothing. The investigation had reached a point that detectives from 1974 could never have imagined. Evidence collected from a teenage girl's clothing nearly 50 years earlier had now been scientifically connected to the man whose name had appeared in the original investigation. The case had come full circle, but the breakthrough raised another question. What would McCurley say when confronted with the evidence? On September 21st, SIL 2020, police arrested him at his Fort Worth home and charged him with capital murder. He was 77 years old. The arrest itself was extraordinary. The alleged offender was no longer a young man in the prime of his life. He was an elderly suspect being taken into custody decades after the crime. The world had changed around him. Carla had remained forever 17. Investigators now had to confront a person who had lived through nearly 5 decades after her death. Following the arrest, detectives conducted interviews with McCurley. Initially, according to testimony later presented in court, he denied committing a crime. Investigators continued questioning him. They told him about the DNA evidence that had linked him to Carla's case. Eventually, according to Detective Leo Wagner's testimony, McCurley began discussing what had happened. The recorded interview would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence presented during the trial. In the interview, McCurley made statements acknowledging his involvement in Carla's death. He described choking her and said he became afraid she would tell on him. His statements were not presented in isolation. Prosecutors had the DNA evidence. They had the history of the original investigation. They had the circumstances surrounding Carla's disappearance and the discovery of her body. They had the decades-old evidence that had finally produced a genetic profile, and they had a recorded interview in which McCurley made incriminating statements. The investigation had transformed from a cold case into a prosecution with multiple layers of evidence. Yet the defense would challenge aspects of that evidence. The case was not automatically over because investigators had obtained a DNA match. McCurley's attorneys questioned the circumstances under which police obtained DNA from his discarded material. They also challenged the admissibility and circumstances surrounding his statements to detectives. These issues would become important as the case moved toward trial. Prosecutors, however, maintained that the evidence connected McCurley to Carla's murder and that the investigation had been conducted lawfully. The courtroom would eventually become the place where those competing arguments were tested. Before that happened, another development demonstrated how much the case had changed since 1974. The investigation was no longer based solely on the physical evidence preserved from the original crime. Modern forensic genealogy had helped generate the investigative lead. Traditional detective work had converted that lead into a suspect. Direct DNA testing had established the biological connection, and the suspect's own statements had added another layer to the case. It was a chain in which every link depended upon the one before it. Remove the original biological evidence, and the modern DNA profile might never have existed. Remove the genealogical analysis, and investigators might not have returned to McCurley. Remove the discarded material, and the direct comparison could not have been made. Remove the detectives' interviews, and prosecutors would have had one less piece of evidence to present. The case was therefore not solved by technology alone. It was solved by technology combined with persistence and investigative judgment. The story also revealed something deeply unsettling about the passage of time. When investigators first questioned McCurley in 1974, they were operating with information that seemed important but inconclusive. Decades later, the same name appeared in a completely different context because science had changed the value of the evidence. The original investigation had not necessarily been wrong to release him. It had lacked the information that modern investigators eventually obtained. That distinction mattered. Cold cases often survive because the evidence available at one moment in history is insufficient to prove what later science can establish. The passage of time can therefore change the meaning of evidence without changing the evidence itself. The Ruger pistol connection remained part of the historical record. The biological evidence remained preserved. The investigative reports remained available. What changed was the ability to interpret those facts together. For Carla's family, the reopening of the case created a new and painful period of waiting. They had already spent decades without an answer. Now investigators were telling them that something had changed. There was a DNA profile. There was a potential suspect. There was a path forward. But until an arrest occurred, until prosecutors formally presented the case, until a court considered the evidence, uncertainty remained. The family had learned long ago that hope could be dangerous. They had seen investigations produce leads that went nowhere. They had lived through years when the case seemed permanently frozen. This time was different. The science was different. The evidence was different. And the suspect was no longer an unknown figure somewhere beyond reach. He was 77 years old and living in Fort Worth. When the arrest finally came, it was the moment the family had waited nearly half a century to see. But the arrest also meant that the most difficult stage was beginning. The case would now leave the investigative world and enter the courtroom. Detectives would have to explain their methods. Scientists would have to explain the DNA. Prosecutors would have to establish the connection between the evidence and the crime. The defense would challenge the case, and the people who had loved Carla would finally have the opportunity to face the man accused of taking her life. The cold case had survived 46 years of silence. Now, for the first time, the evidence was speaking loudly enough to force the past into the present. And as the courtroom prepared to hear the story, the question that had haunted Fort Worth since February 1974 was no longer hidden in the darkness. It was about to be examined under the brightest light the justice system could provide. The courtroom was where 46 years of uncertainty finally collided with evidence by the time Samuel McCurley stood accused of capital murder. The investigation was no longer built on a single lead from 1974. It rested on layers of evidence accumulated across generations. The original crime scene, the biological material preserved from Carla Walker's clothing, modern DNA testing, the investigation that led detectives back to McCurley, and statements he made after his arrest. But the courtroom demanded something different from the investigation room. Every piece of evidence had to survive legal scrutiny. Every search had to be examined. Every scientific result could be challenged. Every statement could become the subject of argument. The case that had remained unresolved for nearly half a century was now being reconstructed before a judge and jury, piece by piece, with the life and death of a 17-year-old girl at its center. The original crime had occurred on February 17th, Sill, 1974. Carla and her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, had been sitting in a car in the parking lot of a Fort Worth bowling alley when an armed man suddenly attacked. Carla was pulled from the vehicle. McCoy was struck with a pistol. Carla was taken away. 3 days later, her body was found in a culvert. The autopsy determined that she had been strangled and that she had likely been sexually assaulted. The investigation that followed generated hundreds of leads, but no arrest. A magazine from a Ruger pistol had been recovered at the bowling alley parking lot, and investigators identified McCurley as one of several people in the area who owned such a weapon. He told police that his pistol had been stolen before Carla's murder. He was questioned, given a polygraph examination, and released. Then the trail went cold. Decades later, the case was reopened in 2019. Investigators returned to the original evidence with modern forensic methods. Material recovered from Carla's bra eventually produced a single-source DNA profile belonging to an unknown male. Investigators submitted the profile to CODIS, but it did not produce a match. That failure did not destroy the case. Instead, detectives turned toward genetic genealogy. The investigation began looking beyond the conventional criminal database and into biological relationship. The resulting research pointed investigators toward the McCurley family. But a genealogy lead was only a lead. Detectives still needed direct evidence connecting Glenn McCurley to the biological material recovered from Carla. That connection eventually came through discarded material obtained during the investigation. According to the later appellate record, investigators sent items from McCurley's trash to the Serological Research Institute for testing. A DNA profile developed from material found on a drinking straw matched the single-source profile from the material found on Carla's bra. The investigators then obtained a direct DNA sample from McCurley, and that sample also matched the DNA associated with Carla's clothing. The forensic evidence had now created a chain that reached from the original crime scene to the elderly man investigators had identified decades after the murder. But the defense challenged the evidence. McCurley's attorneys argued that portions of the DNA evidence should be suppressed. They questioned the legality of the search involving discarded trash. They challenged the qualifications and accreditation of laboratories and analysts involved in the testing. They also challenged the admissibility of statements McCurley made to detectives. These issues mattered because the case had to survive not simply public scrutiny, but constitutional and evidentiary standards. The court held suppression hearings. Prosecutors defended the evidence. The judge ultimately denied the motions to suppress. That meant the DNA evidence and McCurley's custodial statements could remain part of the prosecution's case. The trial then moved forward. For the first time, the events of 1974 were being examined in a courtroom with technology capable of connecting biological evidence from Carla's clothing to a specific individual. The DNA evidence was no longer an abstract scientific concept. It was a link between the past and the present. But another piece of evidence would become equally significant: McCurley's own statements. After his arrest, detectives questioned him about Carla's murder. During the interrogation, he eventually admitted killing her. According to the appellate record, McCurley said he had killed Carla by choking her. The circumstances surrounding the statement later became a major legal issue. Defense attorneys argued that the statement should be suppressed, contending that Detective Leah Wagner had improperly suggested that McCurley would not face the death penalty if he confessed. The state disputed that interpretation. Wagner testified that she had not promised McCurley anything. The trial court considered the circumstances and determined that the statement had been made voluntarily. The issue would later be examined by the appellate court. But during the trial itself, the prosecution possessed something extraordinarily powerful: scientific evidence and an incriminating statement pointing in the same direction. The DNA evidence connected McCurley to biological material recovered from Carla. His own words connected him to the killing. The original investigation provided the historical context. The jury was therefore being asked to consider not a single isolated clue, but a chain of evidence extending from 1974 to 2021. Yet before the case could reach its conclusion, McCurley did something that dramatically changed the proceedings. After 2 days of jury trial proceedings, he changed his plea and entered an open plea of guilty to capital murder. The trial that had begun with the possibility of a prolonged examination of decades-old evidence suddenly changed course. There would be no need for the jury to continue weighing every remaining issue of guilt. McCurley had admitted the charge. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. The moment carried enormous historical weight. A case that had remained unsolved since 1974 had reached its legal conclusion with a guilty plea. Carla's killer had finally been identified and convicted, but even then, the legal story was not completely finished. McCurley appealed, challenging the trial court's refusal to suppress portions of the DNA evidence and its custodial statement. His appeal created another examination of the investigation, this time at the appellate level. The court reviewed the arguments surrounding the DNA evidence and the circumstances of the statement. The appellate court ultimately affirmed the trial court's decision. The legal challenge therefore failed, leaving McCurley's conviction and life sentence intact. The case had survived another test. The DNA evidence remained admissible. The custodial statement remained admissible. The guilty plea remained valid. The sentence remained in place. For the Walker family, however, the legal conclusion could not erase the decades that had preceded it. Carla had been 17 when she was murdered. Her family had lived through years when there was no name to associate with her death. They had watched the investigation become a cold case. They had lived through the changing landscape of forensic science. And then, decades later, they learned that modern DNA testing had finally produced an answer. The courtroom could establish accountability, but it could not restore the life that had been taken. It could not return Carla to the age she should have reached. It could not erase the memories of the night she disappeared. What it could do was establish a permanent legal record of what happened. It could state that Glenn Samuel McCurley was guilty of capital murder. It could impose a life sentence. It could prevent the case from ending in another unanswered file. That distinction is important because cold cases are often described as mysteries waiting to be solved, but the mystery is only one part of the story. The real consequence is measured in years. Carla's family waited almost 5 decades for an answer. Investigators waited decades for technology capable of revealing what the original evidence contained. The case demonstrated how dramatically the meaning of evidence can change when science advances. In 1974, investigators had a weapon-related clue and a suspect who denied involvement. They had no modern genetic profile capable of proving the connection. In 2019 and 2020, detectives could reopen the same evidence and obtain information that transformed the entire investigation. What had once been an unresolved biological trace became a genetic identifier. What had once been a name among many suspects became the central suspect. What had once been an interview in an old police file became part of the history of a case that would eventually reach a courtroom. And what had once seemed like a crime destined to remain unsolved became a conviction. The most remarkable part was that the breakthrough did not come from evidence created in the 21st century. It came from evidence connected to a crime that had occurred in another era. The past had been preserved well enough for modern science to examine it. That is the deeper significance of the Carla Walker case. It demonstrates that evidence can outlive the technology available to analyze it. A detective in 1974 could not have known what DNA science would become. The investigators who collected biological material from Carla's clothing could not have imagined that nearly 50 years later, scientists would use advanced methods to create a genetic profile. Yet the evidence survived, and when the technology finally caught up, the case moved forward with extraordinary speed. For nearly half a century, Carla's murder had existed as an unanswered question. Then, within a remarkably short period, investigators reopened the file, developed a DNA profile, pursued a genealogical lead, connected that evidence to Glenn McCurley, arrested him, and brought the case into court. The silence that had lasted for generations was finally broken, not by rumor, not by speculation, by evidence. And when McCurley entered his guilty plea after 2 days of trial proceedings, the legal system finally delivered the answer Carla's family had been waiting for since the night a 17-year-old girl disappeared from a Fort Worth parking lot in February 1974. The guilty plea did not erase the mystery of the decades that had come before it. Instead, it gave investigators and the public an opportunity to look backward and understand why the murder of Carla Walker had remained unsolved for so long. The answer was not simply that detectives had failed to find the right person. The deeper explanation was that the investigation had unfolded across two completely different eras of forensic science. In 1974, investigators had physical evidence, witnesses, suspects, and investigative instincts, but they did not have the extraordinary DNA technology that would eventually transform the case. Nearly 5 decades later, detectives had the ability to revisit biological evidence with techniques that could identify an unknown male profile and connect it to a living suspect. The contrast between those two periods revealed one of the most important realities of cold case investigations. Sometimes the evidence is not missing. Sometimes the technology needed to understand it simply has not arrived yet. Carla Walker was 17 years old when she was murdered. Her death had already become a permanent part of her family's history by the time modern investigators reopened the case. Her parents had grown older. Friends had moved on with their lives. The detectives who had originally investigated the murder had retired. The city itself had changed. Yet the original case file remained. Inside it were the records of a crime that had occurred in another America, one in which forensic DNA profiling was not available to police. Investigators in 1974 had to work with what they could see, hear, collect, and document. The discovery of the Ruger pistol magazine in the bowling alley parking lot became one of the earliest clues. McCurley was among the people identified as owning a Ruger pistol. He told police that his weapon had been stolen before the murder. He was questioned and given a polygraph examination. At the time, there was no biological evidence capable of conclusively establishing that he was the person connected to Carla's murder. The investigation continued, and the case eventually became dormant. The passage of time created another problem. Memories change. People die. Records become harder to locate. Investigators leave departments, but physical evidence can remain remarkably patient. Biological material does not care whether detectives retire. It does not care whether a case is removed from the headline. If it is properly preserved, it can remain available for future testing. That principle became central when the case was reopened in 2019. Detectives Leah Wagner and Jay Bennett returned to the investigation with access to modern forensic methods. Their task was not simply to read the old report. They had to determine whether evidence collected in 1974 could answer questions that investigators of that era had been unable to answer. The forensic testing produced a crucial breakthrough. A male DNA profile was developed from biological material associated with Carla's clothing. That profile was single source, meaning investigators had a genetic profile they could use for comparison. They submitted it to CODIS, hoping it would match an individual already represented in the law enforcement database. It did not. The absence of a match could easily have become another dead end. Instead, investigators used genetic genealogy. This approach changed the direction of the case because it did not require the unknown offender's DNA to already exist in a criminal database. biological relatives could potentially provide a pathway. By examining genetic relationships and genealogical information, investigators could narrow the possibility. The process eventually led them toward the McCurley family. That development was extraordinary because Glenn McCurley was not a completely new name. He had been questioned in 1974. The investigation had already touched him decades earlier, but now there was something fundamentally different. Modern DNA evidence provided a reason to look at him again. Detectives obtained discarded material associated with McCurley. According to the appellate record, DNA from a drinking straw found in his trash produced a profile that matched the male DNA profile developed from Carla's clothing. Investigators subsequently obtained a direct DNA sample from McCurley, and that sample also matched. The biological evidence had now created a direct connection between McCurley and the material recovered during the original investigation. The arrest followed on September 21st, SIL 2020. McCurley was 77 years old. The contrast was striking. Carla had been 17 when she was killed. Her alleged killer was now an elderly man. 46 years separated the crime from the arrest. Nearly half a century had passed between the moment investigators first questioned McCurley and the moment modern forensic science provided the evidence necessary to charge him with capital murder. That timeline made the case remarkable even before it reached court. But the legal proceedings demonstrated another important principle. Scientific evidence does not automatically end a criminal investigation. It must survive scrutiny. Defense attorneys challenged the evidence used against McCurley. They raised questions about the collection and analysis of DNA, the circumstances surrounding the discarded material, and the statements he made to detectives. The defense also challenged the admissibility of his custodial statements, arguing that investigators had improperly influenced him during questioning. Prosecutors defended the investigation. The trial court considered the arguments and allowed the challenged evidence to remain available to the prosecution. The case then moved forward toward trial. After 2 days of proceedings, McCurley entered an open plea of guilty to capital murder. The jury would not need to determine whether he was guilty because he had admitted the charge. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. The conclusion was remarkable because the case had spent almost 50 years without an answer. Yet even after the guilty plea, the legal battle continued through an appeal. McCurley challenged the trial court's decisions concerning the DNA evidence and his custodial statements. The appellate court reviewed those claims and ultimately affirmed the conviction. The result meant that the legal system had accepted the evidence and left the conviction intact. For investigators, the outcome represented the completion of a process that had begun long before modern DNA science existed. For the Walker family, it represented something more complicated. A conviction could provide accountability, but it could never provide restoration. Carla's life had been taken when she was 17. No forensic technique could change that fact. No arrest could return the years her family had spent without answers. No courtroom could reconstruct the future she might have had. What the justice system could do was establish responsibility and place that responsibility permanently into the historical record. The case also became an example of why law enforcement agencies continue to preserve biological evidence in unsolved crimes. Investigators cannot know what tomorrow's science will make possible. A sample that cannot produce a useful result today may become valuable years later. A database that contains no match today may contain one in the future. A scientific technique that seems experimental today may become routine tomorrow. Carla's case illustrated that principle with unusual clarity. The evidence collected in the 1970s ultimately became the foundation for an investigation conducted nearly 50 years later. The investigators who collected that evidence could not have known exactly how it would be used. They simply preserved it as part of their effort to solve a murder. Decades later, another generation of investigators inherited that work. The cold case was not solved because someone suddenly discovered a missing confession or because a forgotten witness appeared with perfect memories. It was solved because the original evidence survived long enough to encounter new science. That distinction matters. It means the solution belonged to more than one generation. The detectives of 1974 contributed the first investigation. The investigators of 2019 and 2020 contributed modern forensic methods. Laboratory scientists transformed biological material into genetic information. Genetic genealogy provided a pathway when CODIS produced no match. Detectives then obtained direct comparison material and established the connection. Prosecutors brought the evidence into court. The legal system tested the evidence and ultimately accepted the conviction. Every stage depended on the one before it. The story of Carla Walker therefore became more than the story of a murder finally solved. It became a demonstration of how criminal investigations can survive beyond the careers of individual detectives and beyond the limitations of the technology available at the time of the crime. The case had once seemed frozen in 1974, but it was never truly frozen. Evidence remained. Records remained. The memory of Carla remained. And when modern science finally returned to that evidence, the old investigation began moving again. The result was an arrest, a guilty plea, a life sentence, and a legal record that finally answered the question that had haunted Carla's family for decades. The case had begun with a teenager leaving a Valentine's Day dance and ended with a 77-year-old man facing life in prison. Between those two moments stood 46 years of uncertainty. The distance between them was measured not only in time, but in scientific progress, investigative persistence, and the refusal to allow an old case become permanently forgotten. Carla's murder had remained a cold case for generations, but the evidence had been waiting all along. The arrest of Glenn Samuel McCurley in September 2020 transformed the Carla Walker investigation from a decades-old mystery into a living criminal case. But the most remarkable part of the story was not the arrest itself. It was the path that had finally led investigators there. For nearly 46 years, the case had existed in a world without the tools that eventually solved it. When Carla was murdered in 1974, DNA profiling was not part of ordinary police work. Investigators could collect biological evidence, preserve clothing, document injuries, interview witnesses, and examine physical objects, but they could not take an unknown biological sample and generate the kind of genetic profile that modern detectives could use to identify a person. The evidence existed, but its full potential remained invisible. That changed with time. As DNA technology advanced, investigators began understanding that biological material recovered from old crime scenes could contain information capable of identifying an unknown offender decades later. The Carla Walker case became a powerful demonstration of that principle. When detectives reopened the investigation in 2019, they did not know whether the old evidence would finally provide an answer. They only knew that modern science had created a new possibility. The investigation required patience because the biological material was decades old and had been collected under circumstances very different from today's forensic standards. Scientists had to work carefully to determine whether a usable genetic profile could be developed. Eventually, testing produced a single-source male DNA profile from biological material recovered from Carla's bra. That result changed the investigation immediately. For the first time, detectives possessed a biological identifier connected to the crime. But an identifier is not necessarily an identity. The DNA profile still belonged to an unknown man. Investigators first turned to CODIS, the National Law Enforcement DNA Database, hoping that the profile would match someone already known to the criminal justice system. It did not. The absence of a match could have sent the case back into uncertainty. Instead, investigators turned to a newer method, genetic genealogy. The technique had become increasingly important in cold case investigations because it could potentially identify relatives of an unknown person even when the person himself was not present in a law enforcement database. The basic idea was revolutionary. Instead of searching directly for the offender, investigators could search for biological connections. A distant relative could become the first link. That relative could lead to another branch of a family tree. Historical records could then help investigators reconstruct relationships and identify people who fit the known circumstances of the crime. In Carla's case, the genealogical research eventually pointed toward the McCurley family. Glenn McCurley's name was especially significant because he was not a stranger to the original investigation. His name had appeared in 1974 because of the Ruger pistol connection. Investigators had questioned him at the time. He had told them his weapon had been stolen before Carla's murder. He took a polygraph examination and was released. The case moved forward without him becoming the focus of prosecution. Nearly half a century later, modern genetic evidence brought his name back into the investigation. The difference was that investigators now had something that had been impossible in 1974, a biological profile with which they could make a direct comparison. Detectives obtained discarded material associated with McCurley. According to the later court record, DNA developed from a drinking straw recovered from his trash matched the male DNA profile from Carla's clothing. Investigators then obtained a direct sample from McCurley, and that sample also matched the DNA associated with the evidence. The scientific connection was now direct. The old case had found its suspect. Yet the investigation still required another step. Detectives needed to understand what McCurley would say when confronted with the evidence. After his arrest, investigators questioned him about Carla's murder. His statements eventually became another important part of the prosecution's case. According to the appellate record, McCurley ultimately admitted killing Carla and described choking her. His statements were later challenged by the defense, which argued that the circumstances of the interrogation made them inadmissible. The defense also challenged aspects of the DNA evidence. Those arguments mattered because even compelling evidence must be obtained and presented according to the law. A cold case solved by science still has to survive the courtroom. The trial judge therefore had to consider questions about the DNA testing, the collection of discarded material, and the circumstances surrounding McCurley's statements. The defense sought to suppress evidence it considered improperly obtained or unreliable. The prosecution argued that the evidence was valid and admissible. The court ultimately allowed the contested evidence to remain part of the case. The proceedings then moved toward trial. For the first time, the story of Carla's murder was being presented to a modern courtroom with forensic capabilities that had not existed when the crime occurred. The contrast was extraordinary. In 1974, investigators had a Ruger pistol connection, witness information, and physical evidence, but no modern genetic profile. In 2020 and 2021, investigators had DNA technology capable of connecting preserved biological material to a specific individual. The same crime had been investigated under two entirely different technological realities. After 2 days of jury trial proceedings, McCurley entered an open plea of guilty to capital murder. The plea brought an immediate end to the question of criminal responsibility. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. For the Walker family, the moment carried a significance that went far beyond the legal terminology of a guilty plea. They had spent decades waiting for a name. They had lived through an investigation that produced no final answer. They had watched time pass while Carla remained forever 17. The justice system had officially established that McCurley was responsible for her murder, but accountability could not undo the crime. It could not return Carla to her family. It could not restore the years that had passed without an explanation. It could only establish what had happened and impose a legal consequence. Even after the conviction, McCurley challenged the proceedings through an appeal. His attorneys argued that the trial court had erred in refusing to suppress certain evidence, including the DNA evidence and statements he made during questioning. The appellate court reviewed the arguments and ultimately affirmed the conviction. The legal process had therefore reached another important conclusion. The conviction survived appellate scrutiny. The life sentence remained. The case had moved from an unsolved homicide to a completed prosecution, yet the deeper importance of the investigation extended beyond the courtroom. The case became another example of how advances in DNA science are reshaping the meaning of a cold case. For decades, law enforcement agencies often had to accept that some crimes might remain unresolved because the evidence available was insufficient. Modern forensic science has changed that equation. Evidence once considered too limited, too old, or too difficult to interpret can sometimes be re-examined using new techniques. That does not mean every cold case can be solved. Not every crime has biological evidence. Not every sample survives. Not every DNA profile can be developed. Not every unknown profile can be connected to an individual, but the Carla Walker investigation demonstrated why evidence should be preserved whenever possible. The original investigators could not know what science would eventually accomplish. They could only document and preserve what they found. Their work created the foundation for detectives nearly half a century later. That continuity is one of the most important lessons in the case. A detective does not always know whether the work being done today will solve a crime tomorrow. The investigator collecting evidence may retire. The laboratory technician may never see the final result. The detective writing the original report may never know how important that document becomes decades later. But if the evidence survives, another generation can continue the investigation. The Carla Walker case also demonstrated the value of combining forensic science with traditional police work. Genetic genealogy did not magically produce a confession. It provided a pathway. Investigators still had to identify the family connection, determine which individual fit the circumstances, obtain comparison material, and build a case. The science narrowed the field. Detective work completed the connection. The prosecution then tested the evidence in court. It was a chain of methods rather than a single miracle. That is why the case remains significant to modern investigators. It shows that solving an old crime often requires looking at familiar evidence with unfamiliar tools. The answer may already be inside the file. The challenge may simply be discovering how to read it. For Carla's family, that answer arrived almost 46 years after her death. For investigators, it represented the culmination of work performed by multiple generations. For forensic scientists, it demonstrated the extraordinary value of preserved biological evidence. And for other families still waiting for answers, the case offered a difficult but meaningful message. A cold case may be old, but old does not necessarily mean impossible. Sometimes the evidence survives quietly for decades, waiting for science to catch up with it. In Carla Walker's case, that wait eventually ended. The biological evidence spoke. The investigation found its suspect. The courtroom established guilt. And a case that had once seemed destined to remain an unanswered tragedy finally became a documented chapter in the history of American cold case investigation. The evidence presented in court revealed just how dramatically the investigation had changed since 1974. What had once been a case built largely around witness accounts, physical clues, and investigative suspicion was now supported by forensic evidence that could connect a biological trace to a specific individual. But the defense did not simply accept that evidence. McCurley's attorneys challenged the methods used by investigators and laboratories, forcing the court to examine how the DNA evidence had been obtained, how it had been analyzed, and whether it could legally be used against him. The questions were technical, but behind every technical argument was the same extraordinary fact. Biological material recovered from Carla Walker's clothing had survived for decades and had become the centerpiece of a murder prosecution almost half a century after her death. The first major issue concerned the DNA profile developed from Carla's bra. Investigators had sent evidence from the original crime scene to the Serological Research Institute, known as SERI, for testing. Scientists developed a single-source male DNA profile from genetic material recovered from the bra. That profile was critical because it represented biological evidence associated with the unknown man investigators believed had been connected to Carla. Yet the profile initially produced no direct match in the FBI's National DNA Database. There was no name waiting at the end of the database search. No immediate identification. The investigation therefore required another technological step. The profile was sent to IAmAKiller, a Houston laboratory specializing in advanced DNA analysis. According to the appellate record, IAmAKiller used forensic-grade genomic sequencing to help identify the surname associated with the unknown male DNA. The surname was McCurley. That result did not by itself establish that Glenn McCurley had murdered Carla. It narrowed the investigation. Detectives already had McCurley on a list of fewer than 20 suspects who were to be reinvestigated after the case was reopened in 2019. The new genetic information therefore did something important. It accelerated the process of narrowing attention toward him. Investigators then sought independent confirmation. Police conducted what the appellate court described as a trash run at McCurley's home. Officers collected discarded trash from the curb outside his residence. Material from that trash was submitted for DNA testing. A drinking straw became especially important. Scientists developed a DNA profile from material on the straw, and the resulting profile matched the single-source DNA profile obtained from Carles Bra. Investigators then went further. McCurley voluntarily provided a DNA sample to detectives. That sample also matched the DNA profile associated with Carla's clothing. The case now contained multiple genetic connections, but the defense argued that the trash DNA had been obtained in violation of McCurley's constitutional rights. The legal question was complicated. The Fourth Amendment protects people against unreasonable searches and seizures, but courts have long distinguished between private property and abandoned property. McCurley did not dispute that the trash had been abandoned. Instead, his attorneys argued that investigators should have obtained a warrant before using advanced DNA technology to analyze what they had taken from that trash. The appellate court ultimately concluded that the trial court did not err in refusing to suppress the evidence, and it further noted that even if the trash DNA had been improperly admitted, the error would have been harmless because other evidence independently connected McCurley to Carla. That other evidence included the voluntary DNA sample, the pistol evidence, and McCurley's confession. The legal dispute over the DNA therefore revealed something important about the strength of the prosecution's case. The trash evidence was useful, but it was not the only bridge connecting McCurley to the crime. Investigators had another DNA comparison from a sample McCurley voluntarily provided. They also had the historical firearm evidence that had placed his name in the investigation nearly 50 years earlier. And then there was the confession. Before that confession became part of the prosecution's case, however, detectives had to confront the suspect himself. McCurley was arrested on September 21st, SIL 2020. Investigators questioned him about Carla's murder. According to the appellate record, he eventually admitted that he had killed her. He told detectives that he had choked Carla. He also provided information about the Ruger pistol connected to the case. When officers executed a search warrant at McCurley's home, they found a Ruger pistol hidden in the ceiling. That discovery added another extraordinary dimension to the case. In 1974, investigators had been interested in McCurley because he owned a Ruger pistol using the same type of magazine as the magazine recovered from the bowling alley parking lot. McCurley had told the original investigators that his pistol had been stolen before Carla's murder. Nearly 5 decades later, police recovered a Ruger pistol hidden inside his house. The old firearm evidence had returned to the center of the investigation, this time alongside modern DNA and a confession. The significance of the pistol was not simply that it was a weapon, it was a connection between the original investigation and the reopened case. The investigators of 1974 had noticed the firearm connection. The investigators of 2019 and 2020 could now examine that historical clue alongside evidence that had not been scientifically available to the original detective. The case was becoming a convergence of old evidence and new science. But the defense continued challenging the prosecution's method. McCurley's attorneys questioned whether the laboratories involved in the DNA testing had the proper accreditation and whether the analysts who worked on the evidence were properly licensed under Texas law. One of the arguments concerned work performed at Seri in developing the DNA profile from Carles Bra the Da. The defense argued that an analyst involved in the testing process was not properly licensed by the Texas Commission on Forensic Science. The state responded that the analyst had performed preliminary quantification work rather than the kind of forensic analysis requiring the license at issue. The appellate court examined the process and agreed with the trial court that the work in question was preliminary batch work and did not constitute the forensic analysis prohibited by the statute. The DNA evidence therefore remained admissible. Another challenge involved the advanced analysis performed by Othra. McCurley argued that the laboratory and its employees were not accredited or licensed under the Texas Forensic Science regulations again. The court examined the relevant law and the evidence presented during the suppression hearing. The appellate court ultimately rejected the challenge. These legal disputes might seem distant from the emotional reality of Carla's murder, but they were essential to the integrity of the prosecution. A case cannot rely on evidence simply because that evidence appears convincing. Investigators must collect it lawfully. Laboratories must follow proper procedure. Experts must be able to explain how results were produced. The defense must have an opportunity to challenge those results. Only after those questions are answered can evidence become part of a legally sustainable conviction. The Carla Walker case therefore became a detailed examination of modern forensic science as well as a murder prosecution. The court had to consider not only what the DNA showed, but how investigators obtained it and how scientists interpreted it. The fact that the DNA evidence survived those challenges was significant. The biological connection remained. McCurley's voluntary DNA sample matched the DNA from Carlos Bra. The evidence from his discarded trash produced another matching profile. The old firearm connection remained. The Ruger pistol recovered from his home provided additional physical evidence, and McCurley's own statements became another link in the chain. The defense also challenged the circumstances of the confession. McCurley argued that Detective Leah Wagner had effectively promised that he would not face the death penalty if he confessed. The issue required the court to examine the exact circumstances of the interrogation and the language used by the detective. The trial court found that Wagner's statement was a general statement about available methods of execution rather than a promise that McCurley would avoid the death penalty in exchange for a confession. The appellate court agreed with that interpretation and upheld the decision to admit the statement. This meant that the confession remained part of the evidence presented to the jury. The prosecution therefore entered the trial with an unusually strong combination of evidence: a DNA profile developed from Carla's clothing, additional DNA evidence connected to McCurley, the historical pistol evidence, the recovered Ruger pistol, and McCurley's own admission that he had killed Carla. The case that had once depended on uncertain leads now contained multiple independent strands pointing in the same direction. The defense continued to challenge the state's evidence, but the legal proceedings demonstrated that the prosecution was not relying on one fragile forensic result. The evidence reinforced itself. The DNA pointed toward McCurley. The voluntary sample confirmed the DNA connection. The pistol evidence connected him to a clue from the original investigation. The recovered Ruger pistol added physical context. His confession supplied another direct admission. By the time the case reached trial, the decades of uncertainty had been replaced by a collection of evidence that had been tested in court. The prosecution had something the original investigators could never have possessed: the ability to combine half a century of preserved evidence with modern scientific technique. That combination changed the entire case. The mystery had once been about an unknown man who disappeared into the darkness of a February night. Now the investigation had a name, a DNA profile, a firearm, a confession, and a courtroom record. And yet, even with all that evidence, the final decision still belonged to the legal process. The jury had begun hearing the evidence in August 2021, 2 days into the proceedings. After the jury had heard substantial evidence against him, McCurley changed his plea. He entered an open plea of guilty to capital murder. The case that had begun with a 17-year-old girl disappearing from a Fort Worth parking lot finally reached its legal conclusion, not through a jury verdict, but through the defendant's own guilty plea. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. The long investigation had reached its final stage, but the significance of the evidence would continue beyond the courtroom because the case had demonstrated something that investigators across the country had already begun to understand. Old evidence can become new evidence when science changes. A biological trace preserved for decades can suddenly become a genetic profile. A surname can emerge from advanced sequencing. A forgotten suspect can become the focus of a modern investigation. A discarded object can provide a comparison sample, and a case that seemed permanently frozen can begin moving again with astonishing speed. Carla Walker's murder had remained unsolved for nearly half a century, but the evidence had never stopped existing. It had simply waited for the tools capable of revealing what it contained. By the time the evidence was laid out before the court, the Carla Walker investigation no longer looked like the case detectives had faced in 1974. Nearly every major piece of the original mystery had acquired a new layer of meaning. The Ruger pistol connection that had once been only a suspicious detail had resurfaced. The biological evidence that investigators of the 1970s could not identify had become a DNA profile. A surname had emerged through advanced genetic analysis. A discarded drinking straw had provided another comparison, and after his arrest, Glenn Samuel McCurley had told detectives that he killed Carla, but the prosecution still had to establish that these pieces belonged together. A cold case can accumulate evidence over decades, but evidence does not automatically become a coherent case simply because technology improved. Investigators must determine how each piece relates to the original crime, how it was obtained, and whether it can withstand scrutiny in court. That process was especially important in Carla's case because the defense challenged multiple aspects of the investigation. The first challenge centered on the DNA evidence obtained from McCurley's discarded trash. Investigators had learned that McCurley still lived in Fort Worth after the genetic investigation pointed toward the McCurley surname. Officers conducted what the appellate record calls a trash run at his home, collecting 5 bags of discarded trash from the curb. Items from that trash were sent to the Serological Research Institute for testing. One of the objects was a drinking straw. Scientists developed a DNA profile from material on the straw, and that profile matched the single-source male DNA profile developed from genetic material recovered from Carla's birth. That result was powerful because it did not depend solely on genealogical inference. The genealogy had helped point investigators toward a family name. The trash DNA provided a direct comparison to the biological profile associated with Carla. Detectives then approached McCurley and obtained a voluntary DNA sample. That sample also matched the DNA recovered from Carla's bra. The investigation therefore contained 2 different paths leading to the same conclusion. One through genetic genealogy and discarded material, and another through McCurley's own voluntary sample. The defense argued that the DNA obtained from the trash should be suppressed because police had not obtained a warrant before collecting and analyzing it. The legal question was not simply whether investigators had taken the trash. It concerned whether a person has a constitutionally protected privacy interest in DNA contained within abandoned garbage. The appellate court reviewed the issue and ultimately concluded that the trial court had not erred in refusing to suppress the evidence. More importantly, the appellate court observed that even if the trash DNA evidence had been improperly admitted, there was overwhelming additional evidence connecting McCurley to the murder. That included the voluntary DNA sample, the pistol evidence, and his confession. The case was therefore not dependent on one controversial search. The prosecution had built multiple connections. That became increasingly important as the court examined the rest of the evidence. The history of the Ruger pistol went back to the first investigation. After Carla was abducted from the bowling alley parking lot, investigators recovered a magazine from a Ruger pistol. McCurley was identified as one of several people in the Fort Worth area who owned a Ruger of that type. When detectives questioned him in 1974, he said his pistol had been stolen before the murder, but the appellate record noted an unusual detail. Despite claiming the gun had been stolen, McCurley had purchased a new magazine for the pistol after Carla's murder, and investigators apparently knew about that fact. At the time, however, the information did not lead to an arrest. McCurley was given a polygraph examination and released. The case eventually went cold. 46 years later, investigators were looking at the same historical information with entirely different forensic evidence surrounding it. When McCurley was arrested, he told detectives where they could find the Ruger pistol. Officers executing a search warrant at his home discovered the weapon hidden in the ceiling. The discovery did not by itself establish that the pistol had been used in Carla's murder, but it became another significant piece of the historical puzzle. The weapon-related evidence from 1974 had not disappeared. It had remained connected to the investigation, and now investigators had a confession and DNA evidence to place beside it. The story of the pistol demonstrated why cold case detectives often return to old evidence even after decades have passed. A clue that seemed inconclusive in one context can become significant when new evidence changes the surrounding picture. In 1974, investigators had a firearm connection, but no genetic evidence. In 2020, they had a DNA connection and could reconsider the old firearm information in that new context. The evidence did not exist in isolation anymore. It formed a chain, but one of the strongest links in that chain came directly from McCurley himself. After his arrest, detectives questioned him about Carla's murder. According to the appellate record, he eventually admitted that he had killed her. He told investigators that he had choked Carla. He also directed officers to the location of the Ruger pistol. His statements became central to the prosecution's case, but the defense challenged them. McCurley argued that his custodial statement had been improperly induced by a detective's promise that he would not receive the death penalty if he confessed. The trial court examined the circumstances surrounding the interrogation and rejected the argument. Detective Leah Wagner testified that she had not promised McCurley mercy. The appellate court reviewed the evidence and agreed with the trial court's interpretation. According to the appellate opinion, Wagner had explicitly stated that nobody could promise McCurley mercy if he confessed. The court concluded that her discussion of the possible methods of execution was a general statement about the law rather than a promise that McCurley would avoid the death penalty in exchange for confessing. His statement therefore remained admissible. The ruling mattered because it meant that the prosecution could present McCurley's own words alongside the scientific evidence. The case now contained an unusual combination of evidence separated by nearly 5 decades. There was biological evidence from the 1970s. There was modern DNA analysis from the 21st century. There was a firearm connection first identified during the original investigation. There was a Ruger pistol recovered from McCurley's home decades later, and there was a confession made after his arrest. Each piece came from a different stage of the investigation, yet they converged on the same individual. The defense also challenged the DNA work performed by the laboratories involved in the investigation. One argument concerned the Serological Research Institute and the development of the single-source DNA profile from Carla's bra. The defense argued that a laboratory employee involved in the testing process was not properly licensed under Texas forensic science regulation. The state responded that the employee had performed preliminary quantification work rather than the forensic analysis requiring the license. The appellate court examined the laboratory procedure and accepted the state's explanation. The work was considered preliminary batch work, while the interpretation of the DNA testing was performed by a properly licensed analyst. The evidence therefore remained admissible. Another challenge concerned Othram, the Houston laboratory that used forensic-grade genomic sequencing. Its analysis had narrowed the investigation to people with the McCurley surname. The defense argued that Othram's lack of accreditation and the licensing status of certain employees made its evidence inadmissible. The appellate court rejected those arguments as well, but the court made an important observation. The Othram evidence had accelerated the investigation, but McCurley was already on a list of fewer than 20 suspects whom investigators planned to reinvestigate after reopening the case in 2019. Detective Jay Bennett testified that even without the Othram surname information, investigators would eventually have requested a DNA sample from McCurley. In other words, the genealogy breakthrough did not create McCurley from nothing. It helped investigators move faster towards someone already identified in the historical investigation. That distinction is important because popular descriptions of forensic genealogy sometimes make it sound as if a computer simply discovers a killer's name. The reality is far more complicated. Genetic genealogy can produce a lead. Detectives still have to investigate that lead, compare it against historical information, collect independent evidence, and establish a legally defensible connection. Carla's case demonstrated that process in unusually clear terms. The science narrowed the field. Traditional investigation confirmed the historical connection. DNA testing provided direct comparison. Physical evidence added another layer. The suspect's own statements supplied additional evidence. Then, the courts examined the methods and ruled on admissibility. Nothing about the process was automatic. It required multiple investigators, scientists, attorneys, and judges working through different stages of the case. By the time the jury heard the evidence, the story of the murder had been reconstructed through nearly 50 years of investigative history. The prosecution did not have to rely on the memories of a single witness from 1974. It did not have to depend on a confession alone. It did not have to depend on genealogy alone. It could present a collection of evidence that reinforced itself. And that was perhaps the most significant transformation of the entire case. In 1974, investigators had a crime without a definitive scientific identity for the offender. In 2020, investigators had a suspect whose DNA matched biological material from Carla's clothing, a voluntary sample confirming that connection, a historical firearm link, a Ruger pistol recovered from his home, and statements in which he admitted killing her. The case had crossed the boundary between suspicion and proof. Yet even after all of those developments, the final decision still had to be made through the justice system. The jury had begun hearing the evidence, and for 2 days the prosecution presented the case against McCurley. He was no longer facing an abstract accusation based on an old police file. He was sitting in a courtroom while evidence collected across decades was being examined in front of jurors. The past was no longer buried in a cold case archive. It was being reconstructed in real time. Then, McCurley changed his plea. After 2 days of jury proceedings, he entered an open plea of guilty to capital murder. The court found him guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment. There was no negotiated plea bargain that reduced the charge in exchange for the admission. The legal record described it as an open plea. The decision came after the jury had already heard 2 days of evidence. The prosecution's case had been placed before the court, and McCurley accepted responsibility through his guilty plea. The appeal that followed focused on the evidence he had tried to suppress, but the appellate court ultimately affirmed the conviction. The long investigation had therefore survived another legal challenge. The DNA evidence remained part of the record. The confession remained part of the record. The firearm evidence remained part of the record. And the guilty plea remained in place. For nearly half a century, Karla Walker's murder had been defined by an unanswered question. Then, in the span of a few years, that question was transformed by modern science and careful investigative work. The evidence had not changed. What changed was humanity's ability to understand it. A biological trace that once had no name became a DNA profile. A DNA profile that had no database match became a genealogical lead. A genealogical lead became a suspect. A suspect became a DNA match. A DNA match became part of a courtroom case, and the case ultimately became a conviction. The chain was long, but it was unbroken. Somewhere between the evidence collected in 1974 and the guilty plea nearly 5 decades later was the answer Karla's family had been waiting for. It had taken generations to uncover, but once the science caught up with the evidence, the mystery could no longer remain hidden. For the people who had lived with Karla Walker's murder for decades, the conclusion of the criminal case could never be as simple as the words guilty and life sentence. Those words carried legal meaning, but they could not measure the years that had passed since February 1974. Karla had been 17 when she was taken. She had been a daughter, a sister, a friend, a teenager with a future that should have stretched decades into the distance. Instead, her life ended violently, and the people who loved her were left with a question that had no answer. For years, they could not point to a person and say, "This is who did it." They could only point backward to a night that had never received a final explanation. Then, almost 46 years later, the investigation changed. A DNA profile emerged from evidence associated with Karla. Genetic genealogy provided an investigative pathway. Detectives returned to a name that had appeared in the original investigation. Glenn Samuel McCurley became the focus of a new forensic examination. And when his DNA matched the biological evidence, the mystery that had defined the case for generations suddenly had a name. The arrest in September 2020 brought the past into the present with extraordinary force. McCurley was 77 years old when he was arrested. Karla had never had the opportunity to reach 20, 30, 40, or 50. She remained 17 in photographs and memories, while the man accused of killing her had lived through almost 5 decades of history. That contrast was one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Time had moved forward for everyone except the victim. The world had changed around the investigation, but Karla's final moments remained fixed in 1974. For detectives reopening the case, however, time was no longer simply an obstacle. It had become part of the evidence. The passage of decades had allowed technology to develop. DNA science had advanced beyond what investigators of the 1970s could have imagined. Genetic genealogy had emerged as a tool for identifying unknown individuals through biological relationship. Laboratories could conduct analyses that would have been impossible at the time of the original investigation. The case demonstrated the strange dual nature of time in a cold case. Time can destroy evidence. Memories can fade. Witnesses can disappear. Records can be lost, but time can also bring new technology, new databases, new investigative methods, and new ways of interpreting evidence that has remained preserved. Carla's case happened to contain biological material that survived long enough to benefit from those advances. The forensic breakthrough began with the material recovered from Carla's bra. Modern testing produced a single-source male DNA profile. That was a critical development, but it was not the same as identifying the offender. Investigators submitted the profile to CODIS and received no match. The national database did not contain the answer. Instead of abandoning the search, investigators turned to genetic genealogy. Advanced sequencing helped identify the McCurley surname, providing a pathway that eventually focused attention on Glenn McCurley. That process illustrated an important reality about forensic genealogy. It is not a replacement for detective work. It is an investigative tool. It can provide a family connection, but detectives still have to determine whether a particular person fits the circumstances of the crime. They must obtain independent evidence. They must confirm the identity through direct comparison. They must establish a legally sound chain connecting the suspect to the original evidence. In Carla's case, investigators did exactly that. They obtained discarded material associated with McCurley and developed a DNA profile from it. The profile matched the male DNA profile from Carla's bra. McCurley also voluntarily provided a DNA sample, which matched the same profile. The scientific connection became difficult to dismiss, yet investigators did not stop with DNA. They examined the historical evidence again. The Ruger pistol connection from 1974 remained in the case. McCurley had been identified during the original investigation as one of several people in the area who owned a Ruger pistol. He had told investigators that his gun had been stolen before Carla's murder. Decades later, after his arrest, officers found a Ruger pistol hidden in the ceiling of his home. That discovery did not independently prove that the weapon had been used to kill Carla, but it added another piece to the historical record. The case was no longer dependent on one clue. It had become a convergence of evidence gathered across 2 generations of investigation. Then came McCurley's statements. During questioning after his arrest, he eventually admitted killing Carla and described choking her. The defense later challenged the admissibility of his statements, arguing that the circumstances of the interrogation had improperly influenced him. The trial court rejected that challenge, and the appellate court later affirmed the ruling. The confession therefore remained part of the prosecution's evidence. It was a remarkable development because the original investigation had ended without an admission of guilt. The case had spent decades without the suspect's identity being established. Now, investigators had both scientific evidence and statements attributed to the accused himself. The prosecution's case had become extraordinarily different from the investigation of 1974. When McCurley was eventually brought into court, the proceedings represented the final stage of a process that had begun when Carla was still alive. The prosecution could present evidence collected in the original investigation alongside forensic results produced almost half a century later. The old case file was no longer merely historical. It had become active evidence in a modern criminal prosecution. The jury heard evidence for 2 days. Then McCurley changed his plea and entered an open plea of guilty to capital murder. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. The legal system had finally established accountability. The appeal that followed challenged several aspects of the evidence, but the appellate court affirmed the conviction. The case was therefore not only solved, its resolution survived judicial review. That mattered because cold case investigations often face additional difficulties in court. Evidence may be decades old. Investigative procedures from the original case may have to be reconstructed. Witnesses may no longer be available. Memories may be unreliable. Laboratory records may require careful examination. Prosecutors must establish that the evidence is trustworthy and admissible. In Carla's case, the modern DNA evidence and the investigative work surrounding it survived those challenges. The conviction remained intact, but the emotional conclusion was more complicated than the legal one. For Carla's family, there was no possibility of returning to February 16th, SIL, 1974. Before the murder, there was no way to prevent the attack or recover the decades that followed. A conviction could answer the question of responsibility, but it could not undo the trauma. It could, however, provide something that had been missing for almost half a century: certainty. Before the arrest, the family had lived with an unknown offender. After the arrest, they knew his name. Before the DNA breakthrough, the case existed in the uncertain space between suspicion and proof. After the forensic comparison, the evidence established a direct biological connection. Before the guilty plea, the legal process was incomplete. After it, there was a permanent judgment. The difference was enormous, even though it could never compensate for the loss itself. The case also became a lesson for investigators confronting other unsolved murders. The central message was not that DNA could solve every cold case. It cannot. Some cases have no surviving biological evidence. Some samples are too degraded. Some profiles cannot be interpreted. Some unknown offenders have no identifiable genetic relatives in available databases. Some investigations simply lack enough evidence to establish what happened. But the Carla Walker case demonstrated why old evidence should not be casually dismissed. A biological trace that could not be used in 1974 might become extraordinarily valuable decades later. The same evidence can acquire new meaning as forensic methods develop. That principle has influenced the way investigators approach old cases across the United States. Cold case units increasingly examine evidence with modern DNA technology, advanced sequencing, forensic genealogy, and other analytical methods. They also return to old suspect lists, not necessarily because investigators believe the original detectives were wrong, but because new evidence can change the significance of old names. Glenn McCurley's return to the investigation illustrated that point. His name had been present in the original case. What changed was the evidence connecting him to the crime. The lesson is subtle, but important. A cold case does not always require discovering something entirely new. Sometimes it requires understanding something old in a new way. The investigation also demonstrated the value of collaboration. Detectives, forensic laboratories, genetic specialists, prosecutors, and courts each played different roles. No single person solved the case alone. The final result emerged because different forms of expertise converged. Detectives understood the historical investigation. Scientists understood the biological evidence. Genetic genealogists understood relationships hidden within DNA. Prosecutors understood how to construct a legally sustainable case. Cortez determined whether the evidence could be used. Each stage mattered. Remove one, and the path toward conviction becomes more difficult. That collaborative structure is increasingly important in modern cold case work. Technology can produce information, but information still requires interpretation. DNA can identify a biological connection, but detectives must determine what that connection means in the context of a crime. Genealogy can reveal relatives, but investigators must establish which individual fits the evidence. A laboratory can produce a profile, but Cortez must determine whether the methods used were reliable and lawful. The Carla Walker investigation demonstrated all of those layers. Its most powerful lesson was therefore not simply that DNA solved a murder. It was that evidence can remain valuable long after the original investigation has ended. The material associated with Carla's case survived the limitations of the era in which it was collected. Decades later, it became the foundation for a modern investigation. The same case that had once seemed trapped in 1974 suddenly became an example of 21st century forensic science. And that transformation carried a message far beyond Fort Worth. Somewhere across the country, other families were still waiting. Other police departments had old evidence stored in evidence rooms. Other case files contained biological samples that had never produced a usable result. Other investigators wondered whether a crime committed decades earlier could still be solved. The answer from Carla Walker's case was not a guarantee. It was a possibility. Time did not make justice impossible. It made the path different. For Carla, the breakthrough came too late to change her fate, but it came early enough to change the ending of her case. After decades of uncertainty, the evidence had finally identified the man responsible. The courtroom had established his guilt. The sentence had been imposed, and a case that had once seemed destined to remain a permanent cold case had become something else, a solved murder, preserved in the legal record, its unanswered question finally replaced by an answer that had taken generations to uncover. For nearly 50 years, the Carla Walker case had carried a question that seemed almost impossible to answer. How could a 17-year-old girl be taken from a public parking lot, and yet leave behind no definitive path to the person responsible? The answer eventually came not from a single dramatic discovery, but from the collision of old evidence and new technology. That distinction matters because the investigation did not suddenly become solvable in 2019. The physical evidence had existed for decades. What changed was the ability to interpret it. When Fort Worth detectives reopened the case, they were looking at the same murder that investigators had confronted in 1974, but they were doing so with tools that belonged to an entirely different generation. The case had entered the modern era, and the biological evidence recovered from Carla's clothing became the key that unlocked it. At the center of that evidence was a male DNA profile developed from material recovered from Carla's bra. The profile was single-sourced, giving investigators something far more precise than the suspicions and circumstantial leads that had defined the original investigation. But precision did not immediately mean identification. The profile was submitted to CODIS, the National Law Enforcement DNA database, and no match was found. For investigators, that result represented both disappointment and opportunity. The profile had proved that modern testing could recover useful information from the decades-old evidence, but the database did not contain the person they were looking for. The case therefore required another approach. Genetic genealogy became that approach. Rather than searching only for the exact DNA profile in law enforcement records, investigators examined genetic relationships that could reveal the family from which the unknown male originated. Advanced forensic sequencing helped identify the McCurley surname. That surname mattered because Glenn Samuel McCurley was not a stranger to the history of Carla's murder. His name had already appeared in the original investigation. In 1974, detectives had learned that McCurley owned a Ruger pistol. A magazine from a Ruger had been recovered from the bowling alley parking lot after Carla was abducted. McCurley told investigators his pistol had been stolen before the murder. He was questioned and given a polygraph examination, but he was not arrested. Without DNA technology capable of making a biological connection, investigators had no definitive evidence tying him to Carla. The investigation continued without him becoming the person responsible for the crime. Then the case went cold. When modern genealogy pointed toward the McCurley family decades later, detectives had a reason to look at the old information again. But they did not simply assume that the man who had once been questioned was the killer. They needed confirmation. The reopened investigation therefore moved from genealogy toward direct forensic testing. Investigators conducted a surveillance operation around McCurley's home and collected discarded material from his trap. Among the discarded objects was a drinking straw. DNA testing of material from the straw produced a profile that matched the single-source male DNA profile developed from Carla's bra. The connection was no longer based solely on family relationships. There was now a direct biological comparison. Investigators then obtained a DNA sample directly from McCurley, and that sample also matched the profile associated with the evidence recovered from Carla. The scientific evidence had effectively closed the distance between 1974 and 2020. A biological trace recovered during the original homicide investigation could now be associated with a specific living person. But investigators still had to build a case that could withstand the courtroom. They had to show that the DNA evidence was reliable, that the laboratory work was valid, and that the investigative methods used to obtain comparison samples were lawful. The defense later challenged several of those points. Questions were raised about the DNA evidence obtained from discarded trash, about laboratory procedures and accreditation, and about the circumstances under which McCurley's statements were obtained after his arrest. Those challenges were important because a forensic breakthrough does not automatically become a conviction. The justice system requires evidence to pass through legal standards designed to protect both the accused and the integrity of the investigation. The trial court considered the defense motions and allowed the challenged evidence to be used. The case therefore proceeded with the DNA evidence intact. But the scientific evidence was not the only major development after McCurley's arrest. Investigators also searched his home. During that search, officers found a Ruger pistol hidden in the ceiling. The firearm immediately brought the investigation back to its origins. Nearly 5 decades earlier, the Ruger connection had been one of the details investigators considered when questioning McCurley. Now, a Ruger pistol was found hidden in his home after modern DNA evidence had connected him to Carla's case. The discovery did not independently establish that the weapon had been used in the murder, but it became another significant part of the evidence presented against him. The case was now carrying information from 2 separate generations of investigators. The original detectives had documented the weapon clue. Modern detectives had uncovered the DNA connection. The old evidence had not been discarded. It had been waiting for a new context. That pattern repeated itself throughout the investigation. The original case had produced information that was incomplete, but potentially important. The reopened case did not erase that history. It combined it with modern forensic results. The result was a much stronger investigative picture. Then came McCurley's own statements. After his arrest on September 21st, SIL 2020, detectives questioned him about Carla's murder. According to the appellate record, he eventually admitted that he had killed her and described choking her. His statements became a major part of the prosecution's case. The defense challenged the admissibility of those statements, arguing that Detective Leo Wagner had improperly influenced McCurley by discussing the possibility of execution and allegedly creating an expectation that he would avoid the death penalty if he confessed. The trial court rejected that argument, finding that the statement was voluntary. The appellate court later reviewed the issue and affirmed the decision. That meant the prosecution could present McCurley's own words alongside the forensic evidence. The significance of that combination was difficult to overstate. DNA could establish a biological connection. The historical firearm evidence could provide context. The recovered Ruger could add another physical element, but the defendant's own admission provided an additional piece of evidence directly addressing the killing. The prosecution's case had become a convergence rather than a single line. That convergence was what made the final stages of the investigation so different from the original case. In 1974, detectives had questions, but no definitive answer. In 2020, they had a suspect, a DNA match, physical evidence, and statements attributed to the suspect himself. The case had moved from uncertainty to a prosecution, yet the passage of time remained visible everywhere. McCurley was 77 years old when he was arrested. Carla had been 17 when she was killed. The difference represented almost the entire span of an adult human life. The person accused of ending Carla's life had grown old while the victim remained forever young. That fact became one of the most haunting elements of the case. Time had not erased the crime. It had simply carried the investigation and everyone connected to it into another generation. By the time the case reached trial in 2021, many people involved in the original investigation were no longer in the same role. The detectives who had once worked the case had long since moved on or retired. The modern investigators were effectively inheriting their work, yet the evidence connected both generations. The original investigators had preserved material that later scientists could analyze. The modern detectives had returned to names and clues that had been documented decades earlier. The investigation, therefore, became a relay across time. One generation carried the evidence as far as its technology allowed. Another generation picked it up and carried it further. The trial itself lasted only a short time before McCurley changed his plea. After 2 days of jury proceedings, he entered an open plea of guilty to capital murder. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. The moment marked the formal end of a criminal case that had begun nearly half a century earlier. There was no longer an unresolved question of who had been responsible. The conviction established the answer. The subsequent appeal challenged the trial court's decisions concerning the DNA evidence and McCurley's statements, but the appellate court affirmed the conviction. The legal conclusion therefore survived another level of scrutiny. Yet perhaps the most important consequence of the case existed outside the courtroom. Carla's murder became an example of how forensic science could transform cold case investigation. The case demonstrated that a biological sample collected decades earlier could remain useful. It showed that a DNA profile without a CODIS match did not necessarily mean the investigation had reached a dead end. It demonstrated that genetic genealogy could generate a lead that traditional database searches could not provide. and it proved that the resulting lead still had to be independently verified through direct forensic comparison and traditional investigative work. The case also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence. If the biological material associated with Karla had not survived, modern technology would have had nothing to analyze. The detectives who collected and preserved evidence in 1974 could not have predicted the scientific developments of the next 5 decades. They did not know that forensic genealogy would emerge. They did not know that genomic sequencing would become an investigative tool. They could not know that a DNA profile developed decades later would point back toward a name already contained within their original investigation. They simply preserved what they had. That decision became part of the reason the case could eventually be solved. For other cold cases, the lesson was powerful. Time does not guarantee justice, but time does not necessarily destroy the possibility of justice either. Evidence can survive. Science can advance. Databases can expand. Investigators can revisit old theories. A person who escaped identification for decades can eventually become identifiable through methods that did not exist when the crime occurred. Karla Walker's case demonstrated all of those realities. It also showed why cold case work requires persistence even when the immediate prospects appear hopeless. A case can remain inactive without being forgotten. A file can sit untouched for years while evidence remains capable of producing an answer. When the right technology arrives, the investigation can move with astonishing speed. For Karla's family, however, no scientific breakthrough could make the past disappear. The arrest, conviction, and sentence could not restore the life that had been taken. They could not change the fact that Karla had died at 17, but they could remove one of the most painful uncertainties, the identity of the person responsible. For decades, that identity had been hidden. Now it was part of the permanent record. The mystery had become history. The cold case had become a solved case. And the evidence that had waited silently for almost half a century had finally delivered the answer. The conviction did not erase the decades of uncertainty surrounding Karla Walker's murder, but it changed the meaning of everything that had happened since the night she disappeared. For nearly half a century, the case had been defined by an absence. No definitive offender, no courtroom verdict, no final explanation that could withstand the demands of the justice system. After Glenn Samuel McCurley's guilty plea and life sentence, that absence was gone. The name was known. The evidence had been tested. The courts had reviewed the major challenges. The case had crossed from mystery into documented criminal history. Yet the deeper story was still the story of how a murder could remain unsolved for so long and then suddenly move forward because technology gave investigators a new way to read evidence that had been sitting in the case file for decades. Karla's murder had taken place in a very different forensic world. In 1974, investigators were working without the modern DNA databases and sequencing techniques that are now central to many cold case investigations. The biological material recovered from Karla's clothing could be preserved, but there was no practical method for turning that material into the kind of genetic identifier investigators would later obtain. The original investigation therefore depended on what detectives could establish through interviews, physical evidence, witness information, and traditional investigative techniques. That investigation produced leads. It produced McCurley's name. It produced the Ruger connection. It produced a polygraph examination, but it did not produce the definitive evidence necessary to charge him with Karla's murder. Then the decades began to accumulate. The case moved deeper into the category of cold cases, where the passage of time itself becomes part of the challenge. People who witnessed events may forget details or die. Investigators retire. Evidence can deteriorate. Communities change. Entire generations can grow up knowing the victim's name without knowing who killed her. But Karla's case contained something that time could not completely erase: biological evidence. When detectives reopened the investigation in 2019, they were able to examine that evidence with tools that had not existed during the original investigation. The breakthrough began when scientists developed a single-source male DNA profile from genetic material associated with Karla's bra. That profile gave investigators something concrete to pursue. It represented a biological signature connected to the crime, but it did not immediately identify the man. Cody's return no match. That moment could easily have become another chapter of frustration. Investigators had found usable DNA but still had no name. Instead, they turned toward genetic genealogy and advanced forensic sequencing. The approach represented a fundamental change in the logic of the investigation. Traditional DNA database searching asks whether the unknown profile belongs to someone already represented in the database. Genetic genealogy can ask a different question. Does the unknown profile share genetic relationships with people whose family histories can be reconstructed? In Carla's case, that approach produced the McCurley surname. The surname was not a conviction. It was not even enough to establish that Glenn McCurley was the offender, but it gave detectives a direction. That direction was particularly striking because McCurley had already appeared in the original investigation. His name had not been lost. Investigators in 1974 had questioned him because of his connection to a Ruger pistol. He told them his pistol had been stolen before the murder. He underwent a polygraph examination. No arrest followed. The case moved on. Nearly 50 years later, detectives could look at that old information through a completely different lens. The genealogical evidence had pointed toward the same family name. The old investigative records suddenly became relevant again. But modern investigators still needed direct evidence. They conducted a trash collection operation outside McCurley's home. DNA recovered from a drinking straw in the discarded material matched the male profile from Carla's bra. McCurley then voluntarily provided a DNA sample, which also matched. The investigation had moved from a genealogical led to direct forensic evidence. That transition was critical. Genetic genealogy could suggest where investigators should look. The direct DNA comparison could establish whether the individual being investigated was biologically connected to the evidence recovered from the victim. In this case, the comparison produced the match investigators needed. The case also returned to the firearm evidence. After McCurley's arrest, police searched his residence and found a Ruger pistol hidden in the ceiling. The original investigation had centered on a Ruger magazine recovered from the bowling alley parking lot. McCurley had previously told investigators that his Ruger pistol had been stolen. The discovery of a Ruger pistol hidden in his home decades later gave modern investigators another piece of physical evidence to consider. It was not simply a new clue appearing from nowhere. It was an old clue acquiring new significance. The investigation was beginning to resemble a bridge built from two eras. On one side stood the detectives of 1974, working with the technology available to them. On the other stood investigators nearly half a century later, equipped with DNA sequencing, genealogy databases, and modern forensic laboratories. The evidence connected those two sides. The original investigators had collected and preserved the biological material. The later investigators found a way to interpret it. Neither generation could have completed the entire process alone. That reality is one of the most important lessons of cold case work. Solving an old crime is often cumulative. One detective may preserve an item, another may document it. A laboratory may test it decades later. A genealogist may identify a family connection. A new investigator may compare the result with an old suspect list. A prosecutor may bring the evidence to court. A judge may rule on its admissibility. The final answer can therefore belong to many people who never worked together and may never have met. Carla's case was a vivid example of that process. But the investigation was not complete when the DNA match was found. McCurley was arrested on September 21st, SIL 2020, and detectives questioned him about the murder. According to the appellate record, he eventually admitted killing Carla and described choking her. Those statements became another major component of the prosecution's case. The defense challenged them, arguing that Detective Leah Wagner had improperly influenced McCurley during questioning by discussing the possibility of execution. The trial court rejected the challenge, and the appellate court later upheld that decision. The confession therefore remained admissible. The combination of DNA evidence, firearm evidence, and McCurley's statements created a case far stronger than the original investigation had been able to produce. Still, the defense challenged the scientific evidence as well. Arguments were raised concerning the collection of DNA from McCurlius' discarded trash and the qualifications and accreditation of laboratories involved in the test. Those challenges forced the courts to examine not only what the DNA showed, but how it had been obtained and analyzed. That scrutiny was important. Scientific evidence is powerful precisely because it can appear definitive, but forensic conclusions must still be supported by proper procedure. The appellate court ultimately rejected the major challenges and affirmed the conviction. The legal system had therefore tested the modern evidence and allowed the case to stand. When the jury proceedings began in 2021, the prosecution had the benefit of nearly 5 decades of investigative history. The jury heard evidence for 2 days. Then McCurley entered an open plea of guilty to capital murder. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. The plea ended the trial phase, but the appeal ensured that the major evidentiary questions would continue to receive judicial review. The appellate court ultimately upheld the conviction. For the Walker family, the legal conclusion provided an answer that had been missing for generations. Yet the emotional weight of the case could not be reduced to the courtroom result. Carla was 17. Her family had still lost decades of life with her. Her friends had still grown older while she remained forever frozen in the photographs and memories of 1974. A conviction can establish accountability, but it cannot reverse time. That is why cold case justice is often both powerful and painful. It can provide truth without restoration. It can provide certainty without repair. It can give a family an answer while leaving the original wound permanently present. The passage of time makes that contradiction even sharper. When McCurley was arrested, he was 77. Carla had been 17 when she was murdered. Nearly an entire lifetime separated the victim from the man convicted of killing her. That fact alone showed how dramatically the world had changed since the crime. Cars had changed. Technology had changed. Police procedures had changed. DNA science had changed. The people who once knew Carla had aged, yet the evidence remained connected to the same night. In that sense, the case became a reminder that a cold case is not simply an old story. It is an unfinished story. The passage of time may make an investigation more difficult, but it does not necessarily remove the possibility of resolution. Modern forensic science has repeatedly demonstrated that evidence can survive longer than the investigators who originally collected it. The Carla Walker case showed that principle in an unusually powerful way. A biological trace collected in the 1970s eventually became the central evidence in a prosecution conducted in the 2020 act. The